Congratulations, Mr. President.
Trump, the America we deserve. Chapter 2, Competition, Saving Our Schools the American Way. Our centers of learning, they're also centers of crime. Do you think your kid is safe if he or she is off the streets? It's unacceptable. Your schools aren't safe. Do you imagine orderly classrooms? In 1997 and 1998, 28,534 incidents were reported. The total number of reported incidents in 1997 and 1998 was 30% higher than in 1996 to 97, when 21,993 incidents were reported. 1,966 Level 1 offenses, the most serious level of incident, were reported. Level 1 offenses include offenses against people such as robbery with or without a weapon, assault with or without a weapon, sex offenses, kidnapping, and homicide, and offenses against property such as grand larceny, burglary, and arson. 9,175 Level 2 offenses, a middle degree of incident, were reported. Level 2 offenses include offenses against people such as menacing, reckless endangerment, or attempted or actual suicide, offenses against property such as vandalism and larceny, and weapon and drug seizures. A large share of this increase is accounted for by a vast 47% increase in the number of weapon and drug seizure incidents, 4,320 in 97 and 98 compared to 2,932 in 1996 to 97. An additional 1,556 weapons and prohibited items were seized by scanning. No, the above statistics aren't from the police log for the mean streets of East St. Louis. They're from the Board of Education's annual report on school violence and safety in New York City's public schools. That's right, all these violent incidents involved bright kids on school grounds. Involved kids on the school grounds. On the bright side, the New York City schools are proud to report that there was not a single homicide all year, and the number of sex offenses was down from 126 in 97 to 121 in 98. That's fewer incidents of sex abuse and sodomy in public schools than in 96 to 97. These horrifying numbers are just one sign that something is fundamentally wrong with our schools. Hugely wrong. We used to worry about the schoolyard bully giving our kid a bloody nose and stealing his lunch money. Well, now we're worried about our kid getting caught in the crossfire, or our daughter that will be sexually assaulted in a stairwell. Moreover, as the murder spree in Littleton, Colorado indicates, as if we already haven't learned from Pearl, Mississippi, or Edinburgh, Pennsylvania, or Jonesboro, Arkansas, or West Pacadua, Kentucky, or Springfield, Oregon, school violence isn't just a big city problem anymore. The idea of escaping to the safety of the schools of the suburbs completely evaporated in the horror of Littleton. All across America, the story are the same. The story's the same. Our schools just aren't safe, which is bad enough. On top of that, our kids aren't learning. Too many are dropping out of school and into the street life. And too many of those who do graduate are getting diplomas that have been devalued into certificates of attendance by a dumbed-down curriculum that asks little of teachers and less of students. Schools are crime-ridden and they don't fucking teach. Combine these facts, and you're looking at a pretty bleak future for America. Today's economy may be humming along, but how long do we think the United States can survive schools that pretend to teach while our kids only pretend to learn? How can we hope for a healthy society when kids are being forced into a war zone mentality before they even reach their teens? How can a kid hope to build an American dream when he hasn't been taught how to spell the word dream? Public education was never meant to only teach the 3 R's, history and science. It was also meant to teach citizenship. At the lower levels, it should cover the basics, help students prepare study habits, and prepare those who desire higher education for the tough road ahead. It's a mandate the public schools have delivered on since their inception. Until now, those of us whose school years are far behind us like to think back and say, our schools used to do a better job. Well, guess what? They did. What's happening today? Newsday reports this about New York City. More than half of all New York City public school students in 3rd through 8th grade are reading below grade level. Just 48.4% of all kids who entered 9th grade in the fall of 1993 graduated with their class in the spring of 97. When the City University of New York voted to end its remedial programs, it was estimated as many as 46% of its applicants would be unable to pass the basic entrance exams. It isn't only New York City that good schools have gone bad. Widen the lens and the picture is the same. In the United States, 38% of all 4th graders are reading below a basic level. Only 24% of 4th graders read at a proficient level, and only 7% read at an advanced level. The Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel reports that approximately 70% of 4th graders read below what is considered a proficient level. According to a nationwide study by Thomas B. Forham Foundation, the percentage of U.S. college kids taking remedial classes is about 30%. In other words, about a third of our students are going to college to learn what they should have already learned in high school. Parents and taxpayers are paying once in high school, once in college to educate kids in the basics. They're getting fleeced. Nor is remedial education going to save us. We're doing worse than treading water. We're going under. According to school testing experts' rule of thumb, the average child's achievement score declines about 1% for each year they're in school. That gives the expression dumbing down a whole new meaning. Schools may be hazardous to your kids' intellectual health. What happened to our schools, and how can we fix them? We can start by learning what's wrong. 2 times 2 equals somewhere between 3 and 6. Estimating, they call it. When I was in school, they called an answer like that something else. Wrong. They had a solution. Back to the flashcards. But the people running our public schools, like people at the upper echelons of a lot of segments in our society, don't want to damage a student's self-esteem. They're concerned about empowerment. They're worried kids will feel bad if they get a problem wrong or flunk a spelling test. It's better, these people think, to pat a kid on the head and praise his creative spelling than point out that there is a traditional name for people with poor spelling skills. We call them illiterates. Some educators and educational administrators who are at the heart of the problem think being judgmental is the worst of all sins. The problem is that life tends to judge, and harshly at that. There's no room for mathematical error when you're sitting on the dials of a chemotherapy machine, or launching a space shuttle, or mixing concrete for the foundation of Trump Tower, for that matter. Try giving a number in the neighborhood of on your tax returns, and you may end up in a place where there's a very definitive number stamped on the back of your shirt. There's no question that schools are teaching math badly, with devastating effects on students. Here are some of the hard numbers on U.S. student achievement. In the 1998 Third International Math and Science Study, U.S. 12th graders ranked 19th out of 21 nations in math and 16th out of 21 in science. In 1983, the U.S. Department of Education published a Nation at Risk, the study that put the education crisis in the spotlight. Here's the bad news from the Forham Foundation. Since 1983, U.S. schools have graduated 20 million American 12th graders who can't even do basic math, and 25 million who don't know the basics of American history. Over that same period, 6 million Americans dropped out of high school altogether. The study goes on to say the numbers are even bleaker in minority communities. In 1996, 13% of all blacks aged 16 to 24 were not in school and did not hold a diploma. 17% of first-generation Hispanics had dropped out of high school, including a tragic 44% of Hispanic immigrants in this age group. This report calls these kids another lost generation. Some people like to call this a tragedy. Yet a tragedy, in the traditional sense, is brought on by a fatal personal flaw. The musical genius who destroys himself with alcohol is a tragic figure. Our school debacle, however, is the result of a very deliberate, very misguided policy. And it will only be resolved by very delicate action on the part of ordinary Americans who say they've had enough. The The lost art of reading. If reading were gone, some would say we'd enter a new dark ages. My vision is even more frightening. I like to think there'd still be the flickering lights from the TV screens. Not long ago, I read a couple of news articles, a kind of newsprint flood fight, really, about who could take credit for a small increase in national reading scores for fourth graders. Reading scores improved by about 1.3% from 94 to 98. Usually the press conference at which the annual scores are announced attracts reporters who cover the education beat and no one else. But not this year. This time, Vice President Al Gore showed up to take center stage to crow about the improvement in reading scores. Gore failed to note that this rise simply brought reading scores back to their 1992 levels. I reacted to Gore's education strut in a way any Mets or Cubs or Red Sox fan would understand. I was a Mets fan from the beginning. Not the glory days when the amazing Mets shot from the last to first in 1969, but back before that, in the days when Marv Thornberry played first and the Mets finished last. In the National League basement, year after year, what did the Mets have to do with reading scores? Back when the Mets were doormats, we celebrated when they won 2 games in a row. But when you're 39 games behind the league leader, 2 straight wins don't get you out of 10th place. Nobody was fooled. We loved the Mets, but despite their streak, we still knew that they were losers. So when the president and vice president want to break out the bubbly and claim credit for a small tick-up in test scores, I'm glad for small favors, but the guys claiming credit still sound like losers. Hearing about school improvement is like hearing someone brag that their kid was arrested on 3 felonies instead of 4. The kid's still in jail, folks. If the celebrants want praise, are they ready to shoulder all blame for declining scores since the day they took office? And is there really anywhere for U.S. scores to go but up? Memo to President Clinton and Vice President Gore: get serious. Money and schooling. Ask the people who run our public schools what's the matter. And they say it's simple. There's not enough money. That's the one-size-fits-all remedy for whatever's ailing us educationally in this country. At least as far as the educrats are concerned. Our cash-starved public schools, I've read and heard the phrase so many times, I expect to see it chiseled in stone over the school door. Cash-starved Lincoln Middle School. What they're telling us is this: if you paid us more, we could do the job that is expected of us. Could it be true we're not spending enough on education? Look at the numbers. Most of these come from the National Center for Educational Statistics, a federal agency. In current dollars, adjusted for inflation, overall spending on elementary and secondary education in the U.S. public schools rocketed from $15.6 billion in 1961 to $239 billion in 1997. Factoring out inflation, that's over a 200% increase in just one generation's time. And over that same period, per pupil spending almost tripled from $2,477 to $6,961. Again, that's in today's dollars, after adjusting for inflation. What did we get for all that money? We increased the size of the teacher force by 1.9 million from 1960 to 97. We've driven down the pupil-teacher ratio. President Clinton's new scapegoat for slumping scores. It was 25.8 to 1 in 1960 and fell to 17.2 to 1 in 1998. Even in urban public schools, where overcrowded classrooms are supposed to be the norm, the pupil-teacher ratio is 18.5 to 1, less than a student and a half higher than the national average. Over the same 37-year span, we've raised public school teachers' salaries 32% after inflation if you teach in an urban public school. According to the American Federation of Teachers, you're likely to earn about 11% more than the average public school teacher nationwide. This is being tight-fisted? I don't think so. Here's a painful irony about the surge in public school spending. The national average may be 6,146 per pupil, but some of our biggest public school districts, which have the biggest problems, spend a good more than that. New York City public schools spent $7,617 in 1998. Across the river in Newark, it was $10,925. In Washington, D.C., they spent $8,290. In Boston, $8,225. More spending per pupil, smaller class sizes, better paid teachers. All of that must have resulted in better education performance, right? Wrong. Incredibly wrong. From the mid-1960s to 1991, SAT scores dropped like an anvil. An average of 62 points. That should have set off some alarm bells. How can we be living in a time of prosperity, spending like mad on education, trying every innovation our specialists trotted out, and still the scores keep dropping? In fact, in 1995, our kids were still finishing behind Japan in both math and science, despite the fact that Japan spends less per pupil. Did we demand an accounting from our schools of where the money went? Did heads roll, given the outpouring of resources and the lack of results? Did we sound the alarm for real education reform? No, 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 and no! Instead, we allowed experts to recenter the SAT, which means jiggering the average to reflect our new lower set of scores. There's a better world for recentering, one that captures what is really at work here: fraud. Some students may like getting higher scores for no better performance. That's like getting a raise, even though you don't deserve one. In real-world terms, they have been seriously misled. They have been told that they are better educated than they are. They believe they are prepared to move up to the educational or job ladder. Wrong! The education industry is delivering less for more money and claiming no ground has been lost. It's fraud, pure and simple. The question we've got to ask ourselves is, what are we getting for all that investment? A, not enough educational achievement. B, too much double talk from the educrats. C, a bigger school bureaucracy. D, all of the above. And the correct answer is D, which, come to think of it, is about the grade U.S. schools deserve. As I mentioned earlier, there's another issue here as well. Are we spending our money the right way? Might it be, as Richard Kahn suggests, that we ought to invest in the physical plant rather than in educational bureaucracy and teachers' salaries? It's worth considering. It's clear we're not spending correctly now. As much as it pains me to admit the limitations of wealth, add educational achievement to the things money can't buy. Study after study has found absolutely no correlation between education spending and educational achievement. Eric Hukershek, another school researcher, comes to a similar conclusion. In other words, plenty of states that spent less per pupil showed levels of educational achievement higher than states that spent more. That's an awful lot of time and effort to prove something we should have known all along. Whether we're talking about investing in education or anything else, what we get in return is never just a matter of how much we spend, but how well. Self-esteem, self-worth, and self-respect. One major problem is the educator's chief objective, building self-esteem. The 1991 International Assessment of Educational Progress ranked U.S. students 12th out of 14 in international math achievement. According to Daniel McGorty, a school choice advocate, that same study also surveyed kids from each nation about how they felt about their math ability. 90% of the U.S. kids polled reported a positive attitude about math. South Korean kids, the one who finished first in math achievement, had the least positive attitude towards their math abilities. Well, there it is. You got a South Korean kid doing calculus in junior high and worrying that he doesn't have what it takes. Meanwhile, American kids may add 2 plus 2 and get 5, but they're encouraged to feel damn good about themselves. Their teachers probably even gave them a smiley face sticker to celebrate the achievement. This kind of feel-good nonsense has taken over our schools. It's apparently never too early to start feeding egos. Education Week writes about a New Jersey program for kids as young as kindergarten age. The program is called I Like Me. The Los Angeles Times reports that at Lauren Miller Elementary School in Los Angeles, kids spent a part of the day doing I Love Me lessons. All the more impressive when you consider that at that time, their average test scores barely registered in the low double digits. Nationwide, there has been more than 10,000 research studies looking for a connection between high self-esteem and lower levels of crime, drug abuse, or better educational achievement. Well, they haven't found a connection yet, and I bet they won't. Our kids are smarter than we give them credit for, especially when it comes to sniffing out hypocrisy. We pump them full of self-esteem, tell them they're great, when their schoolwork and school effort tell them otherwise. And they get the message that school is just another con game. How can we expect to raise kids' self-esteem when we lower our expectations? What's to blame for the failure in education? One popular explanation is, at least with the education establishment, the kids are unteachable. Why change the system when you can blame the students? After all, they say, take a look at the kids sitting in our classrooms these days, especially in urban schools. Tough cases, right? It's a blackboard jungle in there. That's the not-so-subtle subtext of how many educrats sob stories about how hard it is to teach the urban school student. Too many one-parent families, too little parental supervision, too little discipline in the home, a lot of sociable about the inequitable educational impact of inadequate disposable income. You name it. It all adds up to the party line that some children just can't be educated, no matter how good the school or talented the teacher. Fortunately, there are some signs that common sense may be making a comeback. In Bedminster School in Poblano, Colorado, parents and citizens took action when test scores came back showing just 12% of the school's fourth graders reading at the grade level. Educators scrapped the school's 3-hour per week self-esteem sessions and hit the books. The result? A year later, 64% of the kids passed their reading proficiency tests. It's very easy to make fun of the feel-good educators. I disagree with them. I think being judgmental is exactly what teachers should do. But the truth is that I'm also in the favor of building self-esteem. Self-esteem is a personal quality that can help anybody through life. What I oppose is building false self-esteem. It's the definition of the term that's all wrong. Kids are human. They're hungry to succeed. Teachers betray students when they tell them that mediocrity is success. I say we've got to be firm. Social promotion, forget it. To tell these kids they get a free pass is the worst thing you can do for them. Michael Jordan, remember, was cut from his high school basketball team. It made him work harder. Taking high school education seriously means that it is not enough for a youngster to be on the high school rolls and show up occasionally. Dropout prevention is not an end in itself. A youngster who does not pay attention in class and who does not do homework ought to drop out. The policy in every high school, including the inner-city high schools with traditionally high dropout rates, should be that the students have to be studious in order to receive public subsidy involved in a high school education. If we're going to be serious about keeping these kids in line, we have to get rid of the idea that urban kids can't compete and that they can't be required to walk a straight line in school. As an adult, I've learned the benefit of running a tight ship. As Lawrence W. Sherman said in the Wall Street Journal, making schools more firm and consistent in overall discipline works better than the DARE program. He added that tougher strategies lack political advocates and lose out in the competition for funding. What stands in the way of reform we all know is needed? It's the balance of power. Teachers' unions with too much power. Parents with too less and less power. The lower down the economic income ladder you go, start with the teachers' unions. The National Education Association and the American Federation of Teachers might think that they're different from the other unions. They might even call themselves professional associations to show they're just a cut above. But just because you got a chalk dust on your sleeve instead of drywall dust on your dungarees doesn't change things. Because unions are unions. That's something I know all about. They help workers in the construction trades, but not in education. All in all, it's probably more refreshing to deal with the Teamsters than the AFT or NEA. At least the leaders of the Teamsters don't blow smoke about professional this or academic that. The construction unions I deal with want more in the pay envelope for their rank and file. That's what they push for. That's what they tell you the first time you meet and every time you sit down at the table, morning to midnight. You can respect that, even as you push back to cut the best deal from your perspective. Well, that's the American way. People may sing songs of praise to the competition that makes capitalism what it is. But what we all want is monopoly, dominance in our chosen line of work that allows us to call the tune. No one really wants to compete. They have to in order to survive. Everybody pursues monopoly. The system prevents it. And the result is the world's most competition-intensive economy. Who wins? Customers do. Consumers do. They get more choice and more quality at lower cost. School shopping, if you really want to see how school choice will strengthen both public and private schools and give our kids better education options, you don't need to conduct a comparative tour of inner-city classrooms. Just come with me to the corner market. Everyone knows that 2 bodegas on the block are better than 1. As long as the same family doesn't own both, of course. Why is that? Because 2 or more supermarkets on the same block means competition, fresh produce, reasonable prices, specials aimed at attracting customers who have other places they can shop. Find me a market that has the block to itself. Go on in, tell the grocer you got a problem with the freshness of his produce, and see what happens. You might think the lettuce is a little limp and brown around the edges, but how many blocks are you going to drag your shopping cart to find something fresher? You're locked in, and the level of service you get, or the lack of it, reflects that. The same holds true to public schools. Our schools have grown up in a competitive free zone, surrounded by a very high union wall. Why aren't we shocked by these results? After all, teachers' unions are motivated by the same desires that move the rest of us, and they know how to play the political game. With more than 85% of their soft money donations going to Democrats, and with 1 out of 8 delegates at the 1996 Democratic National Convention, a member of the NEA or AFT teachers' unions, know they can count on the politicians they back to take a strong stance against school choice. If not, they'll find candidates who will. Our public schools are capable of providing a far more competitive product than they do today. Look at some of the high school tests from earlier in this century, and you'll wonder if they weren't college-level tests. Many college graduates, and I'm including myself, would be hard-pressed to do well on some of these. It's a straightforward clash of issues. The Brotherhood of Blackboard Workers wants to keep the door closed to competition. That way, they can run things as they choose, without review. And we've got to bring on the competition. Open the schoolhouse doors, and let the parents choose the best school for their children. Education reformers call this school choice. Charter schools, vouchers, even opportunity scholarships. I call it competition, the American way. What will make our schools work harder? Give students and parents a choice as to where to send their kids. After all, if that school doesn't do right by their child, they're right back in the market again, looking for a school that suits them better. And in an environment where there's competition and choice, there's a constant effort to offer quality at competitive cost. Sound familiar? That's why guys like businessmen Teddy Frostman and John Walton are trying to jumpstart school reform by underwriting $100 million in voucher scholarships for more than 50,000 kids nationwide. They know business, they know the power of competition to improve things, and they know the quality of workmanship when monopoly prevails. Low quality for high prices. That's why school choice caught on in Milwaukee and Cleveland, the only 2 cities today where parents, in this instance low-income families, can direct their share of state funded education to follow their child to the school of their choice. That's why Mayor Rudy Giuliani wants to see New York introduce school choice as a catalyst for change. As the mayor puts it, we should not be afraid to basically turn the evaluation of schools over to the consumers, the parents, and the children. And that's why private philanthropists have started programs in more than 40 U.S. cities to do what public policy hasn't done: broaden education options to thousands more kids. That's why 34 states have adopted charter school laws that give individual groups of teachers, local businesses, universities, and nonprofit groups the right to use public funds to open schools of their own with new curriculums and special programs to succeed with students where others have failed. What will public schools do if they're confronted with school choice programs? Will they compete to see which system can offer the best education to kids? They'll sue. That's what the public education establishment did in Milwaukee, where the country's first ever school choice program was established in 1990. The teachers' unions, lobbyists, fought tooth and nail to keep the program from getting through the Wisconsin legislature. When the lobbyists lost, the lawyers came in and sued to stop 1,000 low-income Milwaukee parents from claiming the school choice voucher the state had voted to give them. That's not all. The superintendent, who also wanted to kill the school choice program, picked a school choice skeptic to conduct the annual office review in hopes they'd be able to study the program to death. And each year, those studies came out. A steady drizzle of hyped-up negative findings on a program parents saw as a ray of sunshine for their kids. But Milwaukee parents fought all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, which let the decision stand. The Milwaukee program survived and today provides vouchers to 15,000 children from low-income families across the city, says Daniel McGrody in Break These Chains. The public school establishment tried to kill school choice in Milwaukee. So far they failed. There's another argument that needs debunking. Defenders of the status quo insist, usually at the top of their lungs, that parental choice means the end of public schools. Let's look at the facts. Right now, nationwide, 9 out of 10 children attend public schools. If you look at public education as a business, and with nearly $300 billion spent each year on K-12 education in the U.S., it's a very big business indeed, and it would set off every antitrust alarm bell at the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. When teachers' unions say that even the most minuscule program allowing school choice is a mortal threat, they're saying if we weren't allowed to keep 90% of the market, we won't survive. When Bell Telephone had 90% of the market, a federal judge broke it off. Who's better off? The kids who use vouchers to go to the school of their choice, or the ones who stay in the public school? All of them. That's the way it works in a competitive system. In the courts, in the state legislators, in the cities across the country, and as I write this chapter, finally, on the state level as well. School choice is gaining ground. In April 1999, Jeb Bush and the Florida legislature passed an education reform bill, including a provision that makes opportunity scholarships in the amount of $4,000 available to kids whose public schools rate a failing grade in terms of achievement test scores. Good policy, even smarter politics. By giving choice to kids trapped in Florida's failing school system, Jeb Bush is forcing public education apologists to admit they hate vouchers so much they'd keep kids locked into even the worst public schools before they give them a choice and a chance. It all reminds me of events back in the South a few short decades ago. Instead of integrating, schools in Virginia shut down. It was called massive resistance, and it was a stain on the country's honor, a moral scandal, and so is keeping low-income kids in schools that all but guarantee failure. When it comes to the best educational environment for any individual kid, there's no one-size-fits-all answer. It might be the public school down the street or the magnetic school across town. It could be a religious or military academy. The right school will enable a child to blossom. Parents know that indecisively. No matter what politicians say. Look at President Clinton and Vice President Gore, those tireless opponents of school choice. What do? Not as politicians, but as parents, when the time comes to send their own children to school. For Chelsea Clinton, the choice was Sidwell Friends, one of the most expensive, exclusive prep schools anywhere in the United States. For Al Gore, the choice was even simpler. For his son, he chose his own alma mater, St. Albans. For his daughters, National Cathedral School. A couple of years ago, when he celebrated his 50th birthday, President Clinton saluted the teacher who made the biggest difference in his life. She was Sister Mary Amia McGee, a Catholic nun who was Bill Clinton's second-grade teacher at St. John's School in Hot Springs, Arkansas. According to Newsday, President Clinton's mother, Virginia Kelly, remembered it this way. I recognized that Bill was a very special kid, and I wanted him in a good school. President Clinton, your mama was right. Shouldn't every mother and father in every city across America have the right to send their child to the school that's special for them? All of us, except the union captivized politicians. All of us, except the union captivized politicians, know the answer to that question. Discipline and self-discipline to achieve higher standards. Students need discipline, and failure to teach discipline is where the schools break down. I'd bet that it's one of the first things most parents look at in choosing a school. I learned about discipline when I was a teenager. When I was 11 and 12, I was cocky, full of myself, beginning to be full of unfamiliar hormones. My father saw what was coming and headed me off in time. He put me in a military school in Croton-on-Hudson for 4 years. It was one of the most difficult and valuable periods of my life. My father taught himself discipline, or he learned it from life, losing his own father and having to take care of his family. I had to learn discipline from others so that I could later impose it on myself. Meanwhile, pity on the poor public school teacher who can't enforce the rules. If he or she can't teach those kids, who will? Brother Lewis, that's who. He's the Capuchin friar who's principal of Our Lady Queen of Angels in East Harlem. Amity Showles wrote about him in the Wall Street Journal, in an article that stands out in my memory. Walk into the third grade class at Our Lady and listen to the children read aloud. 70% are at or above grade level. Walk down the street to PS 102, where just 1 in 5 third graders read at grade level. And Our Lady's achievement grows even more impressive. Both schools happen to be in one of the most poor neighborhoods in America. And both schools draw kids from the same hard world. Kids from one-parent families. Our Lady has them. Overcrowded classroom, Our Lady has them too. The 8th grade class has 46 kids. Most of them will go on to Catholic high school, where 98% of those students graduate in 4 years. There is one difference, of course, between Our Lady and the typical public school. A difference that means all the world. If PS 102's kids underperform, their poor test scores will just become another talking point in the push for more school funding. If Brother Lewis doesn't do his job and the quality of education slips, there won't be any Our Lady because the parents who enroll their children there are paying customers, free to take their kids somewhere else. Families are involved. Brother Lewis and his faculty are teaching in the free market. They can't afford slipping test scores, so they dig in and make kids learn, whatever it takes. What's the key? Our Lady's Handbook says self-discipline is the Christian ideal which all students are encouraged to achieve. Students who aren't making the grade are suspended. How much does it cost to enroll a child at Our Lady? $1,585 a year, a far cry from the $7,617 per student spent by New York City public schools. Still, in a public school tuition, it doesn't always tell the whole story. Endowments and annual donations help meet educational expenses while keeping tuition costs low. All told, tuition included, Our Lady Queen of Angels spends about $2,500 a year to educate each student. Follow the trajectory from grade school to high school. Our Lady produces twice as many graduates, at half the cost for each. But what about the downside we've heard about parochial education? Critics say that private schools are exclusive and exclusionary, where public schools are the melting pot. The fact is, the average urban Catholic school today has a more diverse mix of students, more African American and Asian and Hispanic and white kids sitting side by side than schools in cities and school districts where they spent billions and billions of dollars to bus kids an hour away from their neighborhoods for the right racial mix. They've got a sizable percentage of kids who aren't even Catholic and have no desire to become so, sent there not because there are crucifixes in the classrooms, but because their parents see parochial school as the best place for them to learn, period. They prefer an education cachéism that says 2 plus 2 still equals 4 and cat isn't spelled with a K. A ghetto public school, Chicago Military Academy, Bronzeville, is experimenting with a new kind of classroom order. Students wear uniforms. If they act up in class, they do push-ups. The academy is recruiting students for the armed forces. It's an experiment in teaching real discipline to kids who are going to face a struggle. It aims to give them the tools they need to get out into the world and still have a chance. Parents and students love it. I'm not suggesting the magic bullet for education has to be a religious or military academy. It could be an independent community school with no religious affiliation at all. It could be a school that has a partnership with a business. But don't expect public schools to compete when they've got a captive audience. That's not human nature. If you want to get involved in education reform, you don't have to be a congressman or a Wall Street wizard or have the keys to Trump Tower in your pocket. Just ask Louis Isa Jr., a Cuban-born diamond broker in Midtown Manhattan, who was written up in the Washington Post. Isa helps rescue poor kids from failing schools in his old Washington Heights neighborhood, a mix of Dominican immigrants and second-generation families from Cuba and Puerto Rico. Isa's not backed by a big bureaucracy operating out of Park Avenue. He runs the whole thing out of a couple of file folders in his broom closet of a room at the back of his own office. It all started one Sunday afternoon as he walked down the church steps after Mass in his old neighborhood. A mother came to him with tears in her eyes, telling Isa that she was worried her son would get involved with a gang if she didn't get him out of his public school. All she knew was that Isa had survived Washington Heights and made a success of himself. She was begging for help. Isa promised that he would. That was 12 years ago. Isa helped that woman's son, and word spread. Today, Louis Isa's Operation Exodus has placed over 200 kids in schools ranging from preschools to Manhattan to boarding schools in Texas. Operation Exodus provides after-school programs, mentoring programs, and summer schools. Isa does it by partnering with schools that can provide 75% of their tuition in the form of scholarships. Operation Exodus and the student's family then collaborate to pay off the remaining 25%. The families themselves, many of them living at or under the poverty level, gladly find a way to kick in $500 to $2,000 a year to give their children a better chance at life. Of the 100 high school students currently enrolled in Operation Exodus, all are planning to attend college and have a cumulative SAT score that's almost 400 points higher than the local Washington Heights high schools. All of Operation Exodus's past high school graduates went on to college. A better chance at life, indeed. There's no better way I know to boost a kid to a brighter future, and no place where education matters more or opens more doors than it does right here in America. I've made it clear that our system is in crisis, but I hope I've made it equally clear that there is plenty of reason to hope. We know our kids can achieve no matter what their background. We also know what we can do to help them achieve, and who is standing in the way of improvement. And equally important, we know that politicians follow the winds of public opinion, which is why it's important for all of us to stand up for real school reform. That will mean different things for different people. The only non-option is inaction. What's missing from the education debate? a sense of urgency. Even the Crusaders don't realize that time is running out. Listen to Rudy Crew, Chancellor for the New York City school system. We don't have a lot of time, which is why I feel this incredible urgency for reform. I think we have 10 years tops to turn the public school system around before the public gets fed up and begins to replace it with something else. Now, Rudy Crew is a smart and decent man who wants to do right by our kids. But in all due respect, parents with children in underperforming schools today can't wait 10 years to see if things get better. In 10 years, the 6-year-old who doesn't know his alphabet today is a 16-year-old statistic, another fucking dropout, another kid who forfeits his future because the school system failed him. Rudy Crew is right. We should all feel a sense of urgency, but we don't have to wait 10 years to turn things around. We gotta do it now. My friend, Floyd Flake, knows that. That's why, as an African-American congressman representing his Queens neighborhood, he bucked the Democratic establishment and became a strong school choice supporter. This issue transcends party. The issue transcends race. It deals with a simple question of educating our young people. The public school system is not doing that. There's too many children who are stuck. Too many children who have lost their dreams and have lost their hope of ever being able to be competitive in the society we live in. Nobody's more locked into underperforming public schools than poor kids and their families. And let's call this idea that poor urban parents aren't capable of making good educational choices for their children. What it is racism. These parents worry for their kids as much as families in Shaker Heights or Beverly Hills, and probably more. I don't mean to say that all educators are corrupt or stupid. There are plenty of hardworking people with useful, innovative ideas who should be heard. So by all means, lengthen the class day, computerize the classroom, or return to the 3 R's. Raise standards, remove regulations, create a school without walls, or make kids wear uniforms in the classroom. Let all of these education experiments unfold. Just so long, we let parents choose the programs they believe to be best for their kids. Competition will do the rest. Let's review how I'd save our schools and best serve the students we're depriving of a first-rate education. Start by giving all parents a choice as to where they send their kids to school. Then challenge all our schools, public as well as private, to ask more of their teachers and more of their students. We'll see our schools improve. Demand competition and choice. That's the American way. It's the way our education system, it's the way out of the education mess we're in, and the way forward to the well-educated workforce we'll need to make America the envy of the world. Know your local candidates. Find out how much they're taking in contributions from the teacher unions. Make sure they have spelled out exactly what their position is on these issues. Nothing is more important to the future of America than education. Chapter 3 will be called The Safe Streets We Deserve. Chapter 3. The Safe Streets We Deserve. The streets are like a fever. They show us that our schools need help. They show us it's our society in trouble. And crime is the biggest rhyme in the system and the scandal of American life. We live in the richest country on earth. We have opportunities that our grandparents never dreamed of. We enjoy peace. And even our poorer citizens are relatively well off. Yet we still have an unacceptable crime rate. Yes, it has dropped recently, but it is still much higher than it should have been. And there are many reasons to think that in the next century, because of the population growth, it's going to skyrocket. Our politicians and pundits, of course, don't like to bring that up. They're happy talking the issue. Once again, they seem to believe stuff that don't mention the bad stuff. It might go away. They assume the American people will reject them if they tell the truth. It's time to shine some light into this fog bank. Here's the baseline fact. We can have safe streets. We really do know how to keep the criminal element off guard, but unless we stand up for tough anti-crime policies, they will be replaced by policies that emphasize criminals' rights over those of ordinary citizens. Soft criminal sentences are based on the proposition that criminals are the victims of society. A lot of people in high places really do believe that criminals are victims, and they don't like the methods that have proved successful in crime control. As I write this book, there are protests here in my hometown against Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and his tough and successful anti-crime policies. I count some of my friends among the protesters, but they're singing a siren song. They basically want us to disarm ourselves when we should be preparing for what my favorite crime expert, James Q. Wilson, warns will be an explosion of violent crime. Wilson's analogy of expert opinions, crime, is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand this problem. Let's look at the basics first. The only victim of a violent crime is the person getting shot, stabbed, or raped. The perpetrator is never a victim. He's never more than a predator. And there can be no excuses made for killing old ladies, beating old men, or shooting adolescents. Second, to compare police officers with Nazis is obscene, and it makes it obvious that there's a profound opposition to strong anti-crime policies. Third, there is a philosophy in our country that says criminals plunder because they have little or no choice, and they have been forced into crime by poverty, lack of opportunity, or early childhood mistreatment. That's an excuse? Ridiculous. Fourth, tough crime policies are the most important form of national defense. Government's number one job is to ensure domestic tranquility, and that means tranquilizing the criminal element as much as possible. Aggressive anti-crime policies are the best social program because they allow citizens in all neighborhoods, and especially the tougher ones, to live and work in a safe environment. They also protect children from the predatory mob that brutalizes them at every turn. Many friends of mine, and let me point this out, that they are very well-meaning and decent people, are aware that we can keep crime low if we're willing to take the necessary steps. The problem is that they don't like the necessary steps. They don't like building more prisons. They believe, at the bottom of their hearts, that we put too many criminals in jail. It's an embarrassment to them. Nor do they care for hard-edged anti-crime policies like we've had here in New York. Yes, these policies have brought down crime rates several notches, but they argue the policies have come at the cost of civil liberties. These people are fearful of establishing a police state. I respect their earnestness. I respect their intelligence. They also want the best America possible, and they have a good and decent vision of our country. They're every bit as patriotic as I am, but I reject their reasoning on crime. I would like to remind these friends that they would be singing a different tune, if they didn't have a doorman downstairs, or if they had to walk through tough streets to get to work or to the grocery store. I kid them by saying that they would call the police if someone scowls at their poodle. The fact is, they don't have much to worry about in the first place, but if something does go wrong, they'll be the first to say, "Where's a cop when you need him?" The problem is that they think too abstractively about crime, largely because they have no first-hand experience with it, nor do they tend to know people who have to contend with the criminal element. It's easy for them to believe a criminal is just a regular guy who went off the rails, who can be put straight again with enough time and therapy. Even if this person has killed somebody, they think he can be redeemed. In the election of 1988, we saw a painful demonstration of this dilemma. Governor Mike Dukakis was running for president and was on record opposing the death penalty. During one of the debates, he was asked by CNN's Bernard Shaw what he would do if somebody raped his wife, Kitty. I do not doubt that the governor loves his wife and that he has the same feelings we all do, but he stumbled over his He stumbled over his position and came off looking heartless and confused. He definitely was confused. A few years ago, my mother was mugged. She'd gone to the bakery to buy a crumb cake, something my father especially enjoyed. On the sidewalk outside, her purse was snatched. It was done in a violent and shocking way. Mom was thrown to the ground on her face. The thief was not only brutal, but also stupid. He committed the crime the day he turned 21. He would be tried as an adult, and after similar misfortune, many families might react by holding up, just staying at home with the injured family member and perhaps even seeking grief counseling. And those are all good ideas,
but in my family we believe in going the extra mile. My brother Robert, who works in Queens, contacted the judge trying the thief. He made a point of being in the courtroom during the trial, so the family presence would be felt. The Trumps believe in getting even. It's our duty to keep demanding that our public officials hold the line on crime. Will the real underdog please stand up? Before we get deeper into crime, prisons, and punishment, I want to say one thing about the people who worry about the plight of criminals. They profess to be concerned for the underdogs. But if they thought things through, they would make all the public officials who are tough on crime their biggest heroes. Nobody, and I repeat nobody, does more to help the little guy realize his dream than the public official who makes safe streets the top priority. Criminals target a small percentage of the poor. A recent study shows that most of the violent crime in society occurs in 3% of neighborhoods. These are often places where people are struggling to raise families, people who could use all the help they can get. Kids in posh neighborhoods started getting gunned to the ground. If kids in posh neighborhoods started getting gunned to the ground the way kids have been in the harder sections of town, my friends would change their tune. This country was made great by the idea that when a fellow citizen is in need, you don't turn your back. You find a solution. Nobody deserves to be in fear for their own lives or their children's lives just because they live in a certain neighborhood. No kid's life should be in jeopardy because he was born to a single mother in a housing project. When my sister was a single mother, my brother Robert and I made it our business to visit her son David almost every afternoon. We'd hang out or play catch. He needed men around to connect with. He's since become a successful clinical neuropsychologist. The fear of crime makes the problem even worse. To decrease the possibility of encountering a predator, many Americans avoid going to cities for business, shop, or spend leisure time. We do this so automatically that we don't even realize it. Criminals have patronized American communities into safe zones, partialized American communities into safe zones and war zones. Cities should be dynamic centers of culture, the arts, and entertainment. The substitute of tourism should feel no fear about heading downtown to enjoy the excitement that urban cultural life offers. Crime fragments America, separating our population, reducing economic and cultural opportunity, and forcing most of us to live in some degree of fear. This is why we need to pull together to make sure that effective anti-crime policies aren't watered down or destroyed. We need to establish a zero tolerance policy towards anyone who is getting in the way of the safer America we all deserve. And what's the best way for ordinary people to support tough crime policies? We need to get our facts in line. Let's start by recognizing a few basics. We've heard the good news about how crime rates have dropped, but hold the champagne. As I said before, what American, what government, and the press don't like to say is that the most serious crime experts believe rates will skyrocket early in 2000 because there will be more adolescent boys around, and adolescent boys are especially dangerous. A lot of these boys don't have fathers. All they've got is a mother, and that mother might well be a teenager herself. As anybody knows, a single mother is going to have a hard time controlling a normal boy, especially when he hits strolling age. She can say, "Son, you stay home tonight and do your math," but he won't hear her. A government study of crime in America warns that when the population of adolescent males rises early next century, we're going to have wolf packs roaming the streets, and not only downtown. If these kids are anything like those who terrorized Union America in recent years, we're in for a very bad time. Robert E. Moffat, Edward Meese, and Patrick Fagan's crime turning the tide in America from the Heritage Foundation's 1998 Candidates Briefing Book says that from 1985 to 1993, killings involved 15-year-olds went up 208%, while arrests of 18 to 21-year-olds jumped 119%. Adults, by comparison, were less murderous. The rate at which adults killed other adults was no higher in 1990 than it was in 1980, and in many cities, it was a lot lower. We saw plenty of youth mayhem in New York at Thomas Jefferson High School in Brooklyn. More than 50 students died between 1989 and 1994, mostly around the school, but some inside the school itself. You didn't see many front-page moralists showing up over there to protest their slaughter. They didn't dare venture into the neighborhood, and I don't blame them. Prisons, a permissible attitude towards criminals makes crime more likely, and this will be especially harmful if the expected increase in violence occurs. I could understand the argument that we have too many people in prison if the police were rounding up innocent people and locking them away, but that's just not the case. For the most part, you have to be a long-standing criminal to qualify for jail. This will come as news to our opponents in the debate. Consider, for a minute, a column in the Washington Post written by a woman named Genova Overholzer, who is a pretty good representative of this position. I'm sure she's a nice lady, but she's passing along ideas that are plainly wrong. Geneva wrote an article saying that we have an addiction to imprisonment. Her main gripe was that we imprison too many dope dealers, but that's not all she was upset about. It's hard now to even remember back to the 1960s when America's prison population was shrinking. Leaders of both parties were then talked off emptying the nation's jails of all but the most dangerous criminals and moving to more humane alternatives. Instead, we now have mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, and other anti-crime measures, increasing both the number of people sent to prison out of all those arrested and the length of time served. I'm not saying that fine-tuning punishment isn't possible. There are undoubtedly criminals in jail for victimless crimes, and if a state is releasing child molesters to make room for new criminals, there's something wrong. But with all due respect, people who tend to support that kind of policy and who call for humane alternatives understand that these policies don't directly affect them. Try building a halfway house next door to the Overhauser residence, and soon you'll see what I mean. America doesn't use prisons much more than any other civilized nation. In Europe, the odds of going to prison are higher for some offenses than they are here, lower for others, and about the same for robbery or homicide. Prison sentences are generally longer in the United States for any other crime than murder. Crime expert James Wilson has some other interesting facts we need to be aware of. Europeans have, in fact, taken the lead in several types of crime. All the world is coming back to look at America, Wilson says. In 1981, the burglary rate in Great Britain was much less than the U.S. Within 6 years, the two rates were the same. Today, British homes are more likely to be burglarized than the American ones. In 1980, the rate at which automobiles were stolen was lower in France than in the U.S. Today, the reverse is true. By 1984, the burglary rate in the Netherlands was nearly twice that in the United States of America. In Australia and Sweden, several forms of theft are more common than they are here. The fact that we are ahead in murders is nothing new. According to Wilson, big American cities have had more homicides than comparable European ones for almost as long as anyone can find records. New York and Philadelphia have been more murderous than London since the early part of the 19th century. No, the problem isn't that we have too many people locked up. It's that we don't have enough criminals locked up. Wilson's figures show that dangerous criminals had less chance of getting arrested this decade than they did 20 years earlier. And if they got tossed into a state prison, they served shorter sentences than at any time since the 1940s. Besides keeping criminals off the streets, prisons are also partly responsible for the decrease in crime. Guns. It's often argued that the American murder rate is high because guns are more available here than in any other country. Like a tragedy after the massacre at Columbine High School, anybody can feel that it's too easy for Americans to get their holds on weapons, but nobody has a good solution. This is another issue where you see the extremes of the two existing major parties. Democrats want to confiscate all guns, which is a dumb idea because only the law-abiding citizens would turn in their guns, and the bad guys would be the ones left armed. The Republicans walk the NRA line and refuse even limited restrictions. I generally oppose gun control, but I support the ban on assault weapons, and I also support a slightly longer waiting period to purchase a gun. With today's internet technology, we should be able to tell within 72 hours if a potential gun owner has a record. Capital punishment. Long story short. I don't buy the idea that we can redeem all criminals. Redemption is usually considered the business of higher powers. Nor do I buy the line that capital punishment is uncivilized. People opposed to capital punishment in this country say our high crime rate is caused by our harsh punishments. They confuse cause with effect. I say that major crimes in this country deserve harsh punishments. We haven't gone far enough. There is no good reason not to execute heinous criminals. Take, for instance, the terrible dragging death of James Byrd in Jasper, Texas. We're all familiar with what happened. 3 white goons, and for no reason, waylaid Byrd, a black man, as he was coming back from a niece's wedding, got chained behind a truck and was dragged through a poor residential neighborhood until he was finally dismembered. The Texas jury knew what it had to do. At the time of this writing, one of the perpetrators, John William King, has been sentenced to die by lethal injection, and a second is about to be sentenced. My only complaint is that lethal injection is too comfortable a way for these criminals to go. I totally reject the idea that hanging these sorts of criminals is uncivilized. In fact, I believe that letting them live would be totally uncivilized. They've taken an innocent life, so they should have to give theirs in return. That's the least they can do. They don't deserve to be put in prison where they can spend the rest of their time working out, reading, watching TV, earning advanced degrees, filing bogus lawsuits, and even getting married. For this type of person, prison is a social promotion. Nor do I accept the argument that capital punishment doesn't do any good. I think it is a positive in 2 senses. First, civilized people don't put up with barbaric behavior, such as dragging people to death behind pickup trucks. Would it have been civilized to put Hitler in prison? No, it would have been outright affront to civilization. The same is true of criminals who prey on innocent men, women, and children. By the acts that they have not only rejected civilization, but they also declare war on it. And I don't care if the victim is a CEO or a floor sweeper.
I think it is a positive in 2 senses. First, civilized people don't put up with barbaric behavior, such as dragging people to death behind pickup trucks. Would it have been civilized to put Hitler in prison? No, it would have been an outright affront to civilization. The same is true of criminals who prey on innocent men, women, and children. By their acts, they have not only rejected civilization, but also declared war on it. And I don't care if the victim is a CEO or a floor sweeper. A life is a life, and if you criminally take an innocent life, you'd better be prepared to forfeit your own. James Byrd wasn't famous. He didn't have much money or power. He didn't have a job. So in purely financial terms, you could say he was a nobody. But he was a human being and an American citizen. He had family and friends who now miss him. And he had his own vision, his own version of the dream, no matter how humble it might have been. He was anything but a nobody. Any civilization worthy of the name would treat his murders the same way they would treat rabid animals. Second, I can't believe that executing criminals doesn't have a deterrent effect. To point out the extremely obvious, 100% of the people who are executed never commit another crime. And it seems self-evident, we can't put numbers to this, that a lot of people who might otherwise commit a capital crime are convinced not to, because they know there's a chance they could die for it. Not all crime is irrational. Young male murderers in their teens and 20s, we are constantly told, are led astray by violent music and violent movies. Fair enough, I believe that people are affected by what they read, see, hear, and experience. Only a fool believes otherwise. So you can't say on one hand that a kid is affected by music and movies, and then turn around and say he is absolutely not affected when he turns on the evening news and sees that a criminal has gone to the chair for killing a child. Obviously, capital punishment isn't going to deter everyone. But how can it not put the fear of death into many would-be killers. There's no hotter crime issue, at least where I live, than capital punishment. That's why I was glad when George Pataki came to the governorship of New York promising to restore the death penalty. George took a lot of heat, but he's doing civilization's heavy lifting. In the general population, a huge percentage of crime victims are kids, especially when it comes to violent crime. Kids between 12 and 19 are twice as likely to be victims of violent crime as people between 25 and 34, and 3 times more likely than people 35 to 49. When you compare kids 12 to 19 with people 65 and older, their violent crime victimization rate is 20 times higher. 13% of murder victims are under 18. 28% are under 23. People 18 to 22, who are only 7% of the population, are 15% of the murder victims. If your heart is really in helping our diverse population, instead of merely paying lip service, then your first job is to support tough anti-crime measures. If you really want to do something for the kids, especially the most vulnerable kids, this is where you can make a huge difference. But I don't want to make this a minority/majority thing. There's way too much of that in America as it is. Instead, let me offer a larger principle. The people who wrote our Constitution were clear in their belief that providing for the public safety is at the top of the responsibilities government has. All of us should feel safe in our homes and on our streets. Safety should be a birthright, like free speech. It is the foundation on which the American dream was built. This is an idea that should unite all of us, no matter where we come from. When we lose our sense of safety, we lose our birthright. 10 years ago, there was a brutal mugging in Central Park of a young woman jogger, a Wall Street executive, by a gang of young men. The woman's life hung in the balance for some time. Somehow I began to hear about a great deal of sympathy for the young men. They had been so brutalized by the system. It was said that they couldn't be held entirely responsible for the crime. I took a full-page ad in the New York Times to object and to state my belief that capital punishment would be the proper way to deal with the young men if the woman died. I was amazed by the number of politicians who called to express sympathy, but who refused to take a similar policy position publicly. They were afraid of offending some of their constituents. That's a response from today's career politicians. Cell-growth criminals are often returned to society because of their forgiving judges. Well, this has to stop. A judge who decides unilaterally to reduce sentences can cause immediate damage to a community if he or she releases dangerous criminals from jail. That's why we need to hold judges more accountable. And the best way to make that happen is to elect them. When they hurt us, we need to make sure we can vote them out of the job. Think what wonders a public vote would work on the career of Norma Shapiro, a district court judge in Pennsylvania who was appointed by President Jimmy Carter. I think Carter has done a lot for the world, but George Norma Shapiro was not one of his most brilliant appointments. Shapiro once ordered the release of 600 prisoners, apparently because she thought prisons were getting too crowded. I should add that she ordered the release of 600 prisoners per week. Well, guess what happened next? As reported in Crime, Turning the Tide in America, the U.S. Senate brought in witnesses in June 1997 to find out the extent of the disaster Judge Shapiro had created. They described a nightmare. One witness told the Senate judiciary community that during one 18-month period after Shapiro's jailbreak, the released convicts committed nearly 10,000 crimes, including 79 murders, 90 rapes, and hundreds of other violent crimes. One victim, Daniel Boyle, was a 21-year-old Philadelphia police officer. From 1988 to 1992, 20% of thugs arrested for killing cops were out on probation or parole. In my opinion, Judge Shapiro was a willing accessory to all those crimes. Unfortunately, there are plenty of Shapiros out there, which is one major reason why our streets are full of dangerous convicts. According to the Bipartisan Group Council on Crime in America, on any given day there are about 1.5 times more convicted violent offenders out on the streets on probation or parole than there are behind bars. Clearly, we don't have too many people in prison. Quite the contrary. Meanwhile, the rest of us need to rethink prisons and punishment. The next time you hear someone say there are too many people in prison, ask them how many thugs they're willing to relocate to their neighborhood. The answer? None. Enforceable restraint. What else can we do to make the streets safer? Obviously, you can't force self-restraint on would-be criminals. When individuals or communities can't prevent crime, the balance has to be maintained by law enforcement. If people won't restrain themselves, the cops will have to restrain them. Can restraint be taught? That's not easy, but it can be done, at least to a degree. Let's look at a few things that seem to be working. We can start out by making it clear to teenage mothers that they aren't going to get some public assistance unless they jump through some pretty small hoops. Some people suggest making them live in group homes or live in some kind of adult supervision homes. That makes sense. A lot of these girls don't have fathers or full-time parents of any sort, but there are people, I think, we call them saints, who dedicate their lives to helping kids like this. Whoever they are, and whether they work out of a church, a temple, or some kind of public facility, they deserve all our support. We're also seeing that a lot of the inner city adults want to do the best they can by their kids, even though they might have made some mistakes in the past before. Toby Jackson Toby, an expert on crime, tells a story about adult learners that I think is worth repeating, and that we should hope is copied across the nation. At Chicago's DuSable High School, an all-black school close to a notorious public housing project, dropouts regarded by current students as middle-aged hungered for a second chance at a high school education. A 39-year-old father of 6 children, a 29-year-old mother of a 14-year-old son, who, like his mother, was a freshman at DuSable, and a 39-year-old mother of 5 children, all had come to believe that dropping out a decade or two earlier had been a terrible mistake. Some of these adult students were embarrassed to meet their children in the hallways. Some of their children were embarrassed to have their parents as schoolmates. And some of the teachers at the high school were initially skeptical about mixing teenagers and adults in classes. But everybody at DuSable High School agreed that the adult students lent seriousness to the education atmosphere and became role models for younger students. Political advocates, to no one's surprise, backed the same kind of programs that coddle older troublemakers. The Wall Street Journal reports a University of Southern California study of a crime gang prevention program found that the program was actually keeping the gang together and so perpetrating violent crime. Author Lawrence Sherman wrote, "When the program went under, the gang broke up and there was less crimes. But we need to try to teach kids restraint." Well, let's face the facts. Society can only do so much in this area. It can't be everyone's parent. What society can do, however, is make it clear that if you want to choose to break the law, there will be consequences. In New York City, under Mayor Giuliani, law enforcement has set a standard for the rest of the nation. Our murder rate is at its lowest since 1967. The incidence of forcible rape in the city is below the national average. In fact, violent crime is down so much that Boulev and Columbia Presbyterian hospitals are trying to find new ways to train their trauma surgeons. The fact is that New York is doing well because the police and courts have adopted a crime-fighting attitude that doesn't care where you came from, only how you behave, and doesn't care what your personal background is. It only cares that you obey the law. When you break faith with the law, it only cares about bringing you to justice. It doesn't care if you don't like the idea of going to jail, because this attitude has it that jail is where criminals belong. In fact, our police are hunting out for the types of people who should be in jail. Our force is proactive, not reactive. The attitude is working wonders for all of our citizens, and especially for those who have been abandoned by previous feel-good administrations. What has New York been doing right? Giuliani's first police commissioner, William Bratton, was the first to see that the job of the police wasn't to sit around waiting to answer 911 calls and hope that the person on the other line was still breathing. It was Bratton who reoriented the police from being reactive to being proactive. He targeted patrols and crime prevention on hotspots. He insisted on treating minor crimes, subway cheaters, and minor vandals as persecutors to more serious crimes and potential signals to others that anything goes. In other words, the word went out. We're not going to let this little stuff slide. And that has made a big difference. Sure, it has brought attention, it has brought the moral streakers out for a few afternoons of protest, but as our current police commissioner, Howard Safir, points out, proof is in the pudding. I'm not going to be bullied by community activists who say, we want feel-good cops. The bottom line is crime reduction. It's time for the real underdogs, you and me, to get up on our hind legs. We must be the perpetrators in a movement to reclaim our streets and neighborhoods, to be able to breathe freely, knowing our kids are safe. We know we deserve a crime-free America. Whatever my official occupation during the next few years, I'm going to be fighting for this dream. The next chapter is called Chapter 4, The Foreign Policy We Deserve. Chapter 4, The Foreign Policy We Deserve. In American politics stops at the water's edge. It was a rule, a good rule in many ways. It meant that here was an old-fashioned home. However, much we disagreed at home, we put it on a united front for other countries. It would be irresponsible to break that rule. I'm not going to criticize our foreign policy in general, but there are a few very specific problems I want to address in the modern world. You can't very easily draw up a simple, general foreign policy. I was busy making deals during the last decade of the Cold War. I would imagine that for employees of the State and Defense Departments, the world looked very different then. Foreign policy was a big chess game. There was us, the United States, and our close allies, and there was them, the Soviet Union. Everyone else was a bystander. Now the game has changed. We're the only major player. We deal with all the other nations of the world on a case-by-case basis, and a lot of those bystanders don't look so innocent. I believe that the day of the chess player is over. American foreign policy has to be put in the hands of a deal maker. Two great deal makers have served as president. One of them was Franklin D. Roosevelt, who got us through World War II, and the other was Richard Nixon, who began our dialogue with communist China and forced the Russians to the bargaining table to achieve the first meaningful reductions in nuclear arms. A true deal maker can keep many balls in the air, weigh the competing interests of other nations, and above all, constantly put America's best interests first. The true deal maker knows when he has to be tough and when to back off. He knows when to be bluff, and he knows when to threaten, understanding that you can only threaten when prepared to carry out the threat. The deal maker is cunning, secretive, focused, and never settles for less than he wants. It's been a long time since America had a president like that. Maybe we Americans pump ourselves up too much, though we deserve to boast. We love our country. We're proud of our prosperity and democratic way of life. We think that what's self-evident to us must be self-evident to everyone else too. If other countries or governments oppose or conspire against us, we must assume there must be some terrible miscommunication. Nothing like a few treaties, trade deals, and summit toasts won't patch over. Even during the Cold War, our diplomats were constantly falling over themselves to make a goodwill offering at the bargaining table, as if the problem were to convince our adversaries of our pure and noble intentions. We're flirting with the same kind of mistake now in debating the nuclear non-proliferation. We're flirting with the same kind of mistake now in debating the nuclear treaty. All the major powers may sign such a treaty, but no one will obey it but us. I oppose such agreements for the same reason I oppose gun control. When weapons are banned, only the outlaws have them. Americans look into the mirror and see big-hearted citizens of the world's only superpower. We've got a lot to brag about. We protect other nations when they're in trouble. We lead the world in foreign aid. We're everyone's favorite trading partner. We take in refugees and immigrants at 1 million or so a year. We bail out insolvent governments and prop up weak ones. We mediate interactive disputes. We have standing armies and jet fighter squadrons and fleets all over the world. We do it all. A lot of the time, we don't even bother to send a bill. The generosity leads to a very poor kind of deal-making, because We are such a kind and generous nation. It's hard for us to believe that some people around the world don't actually like us, that we have enemies dead set against us. We're a little naive sometimes, acting as an older brother to regimes that are playing us for suckers. In fact, playing dumb seems to be the formula for our foreign policy thinkers to follow. I'm not saying we need to be hard-hearted, but we need to be a lot more hard-headed, or we can expect big trouble ahead. I can hear the experts now. Where does Trump, the real estate guy, get off thinking he knows more than we do about the international scene? Experts are always defensive, and for good reason. They're so often wrong. A little humility would do these people good. During the Cold War, for example, the newspapers and policy journals were full of geopolitical deep thinking explaining why America could never hope to prevail over the Soviet Union. The best we could expect was to contain communism. These learned people insisted. They were, of course, totally wrong about the most important international development in the last half of the century. In business terms, that would be like predicting that communism would become a great economic engine, which, to no one's surprise, was exactly what some authoritarian people told us. In the pages of the venerable journal Foreign Affairs, one expert wrote that the Soviet Union is not now, nor will it be during the next decade, in the throes of a true economic crisis, for it boasts enormous, unused reserves of political and economic stability. What an extraordinary investment opportunity! Fortunately, few businessmen fell for that analysis, but because very few politicians were ready for the fall of the Eastern Empire, we had no trade strategy for a dismembered Soviet Union. We weren't ready to address the challenges on the international business scene. Remember in the late 1980s, when all the experts warned how the American economy would soon be eclipsed by the Asian tigers and how Japan was going to all but take over the world? Today, Japan, not nearly as strong as it was, is in a monumental liquidity crisis, while the rest of the Asian nations are lining up, hat in hand, for IMF bailouts. Their battle cry, "Feed us, please." And as late as 1991, there was a great deal of fashionable theorizing about the end of history. The idea was that the demise of the Soviet Union and the victory of capitalism were entering a trouble-free era of peace and guaranteed prosperity. These guys apparently hadn't heard of Islamic fundamentalism, miniaturized weapons, terrorism, or the People's Republic of China. You know what they say about economists. They will know today why the things they predicted yesterday didn't happen today. Many of America's experts in foreign policy are no different. They write mostly for their fellow experts, and, as with journalists and pundits generally, nobody ever bothers going back to check anyone else's track record. Add it all up, and there's only one conclusion. The experts have a very sad story, have a very sorry record as odds makers. This isn't to say that I don't study what knowledgeable people have to say. One of the true experts in foreign relations, the great military strategist Karl von Clausewitz, long dead, gave advice I still found valuable. Know your enemy. Every time our country has to grief in world affairs, it's because we didn't pay attention. Whenever we think we're invulnerable, whenever we turn around, whenever we look around, the world will start to feel all safe and sound, as if it's smooth sailing up ahead and the world is full of friends. That's when the icebergs start appearing. Just off the bow. Titanic was a great movie, but the decision-making skills of the great ship's captain are a terrible model for how to conduct foreign policy. Hard hat diplomacy. Henry Kissinger has told me that American foreign policy is always shifting back and forth between two extremes, either starry-eyed idealism or brooding isolationism. Either we're setting forth on some grand crusade or we're turning our back on the world for as long as we possibly can. I think Kissinger is absolutely right. Americans have always been missionaries at heart, believing that our good intentions and good money will always prevail. We have so much faith in the American dream that we can't understand why everybody in the world doesn't share our enthusiasm. Our other tack is to turn away from the big world and hope for the best. The result is that problems sometimes get worse until we're left with no choice but to get involved, usually at a much greater cost than if we'd intervened earlier. The key is prudence, just the right balance of idealism and practical good sense. High ideals and grand plans will get you only so far. You gotta know what's doable and what isn't. You have to know how to bargain. Ronald Reagan played a major role in ending the Cold War. He didn't flinch from calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. But he didn't flinch from the big chance to strike a deal either. He saw his big chance and took it, surprising conservatives and liberals alike. Many of my friends still wince at the mention of Reagan. They can't face the fact that he proved them wrong about a lot of things. Here was a man dismissed as an amateur and practically a public menace. Remember when Reagan was the cowboy who was going to get us in the nuclear war, who was bold enough to announce that the communist world could not only be contained but also defeated? These days they like to ascribe his achievements to luck, but that's nonsense. Nobody's luck is that good. No, Reagan won because he believed in America and believed in toughing it out, even when under fire from his critics. He had the nerve to craft his policies towards dominance, always with his eye out for the right deal. Reagan recognized in Gorbachev a man willing to shake things up, primarily because Gorbachev was smart enough to see that his country was already well down the tubes. Anybody who believes that the Berlin Wall would have come down in Monville Anyone who believes that the Berlin Wall would have come down if Mondale were elected in 1984 doesn't deserve to be taken seriously. But despite what the experts say about the post-Cold War world, we have not yet reached the end of history. Quite the contrary. We're the biggest and best, and everybody wants a piece of us. The years ahead will be filled with challenges made all the more difficult by the failure of those in the political game to talk straight. If we are blindsided by the crises, we are more likely to make poor choices. If we pay attention and act like a hard-headed, self-confident superpower instead of a high school guidance counselor, we'll be rested and ready, even when the inevitable crunches come. How to take on China? Our biggest long-term challenge will be China. Obviously, China isn't the miserable place it was under Chairman Mao, but the massacre at Tiananmen Square was only 10 years ago. Despite the world's outrage, the Chinese people still have a few political rights to speak of. China is a different place today, and we should all be grateful for that. The Chinese people certainly are. Chinese government leaders, though they concede little, desperately want us to invest in their country. Though we have the upper hand, we're way too eager to please the Chinese. We see them as a potential market, and we tend to curry favor with them, even at our own expense of our own national interests. Our China policy under Presidents Clinton and Bush has been aimed at changing the Chinese regime by incentives, both economic and political. The intention has been good, but it's clear to me that the Chinese have been getting far too easy a ride. For years now, American CEOs have been jetting back and forth to Beijing, bearing the good news of expanded trade and economic reform. I've been throughout Asia, and even a few years ago, among a number of other political economies, China seemed particularly impressive, showing signs of tremendous growth and potential. So it's understandable that businessmen come back from China aglow with dreams. 1 billion plus people would be a huge consumer market. Investment in China is a risky business, however. Spending and saving patterns are not anything like they are here, and personal income is low. I'm not going to be opening a hotel there anytime soon, but maybe someday it could happen. Despite the opportunity, I think we need to take a much harder look at China. There are major problems that too many at the highest reaches of business want to overlook. There is, as I mentioned, the human rights situation. The Clinton administration, which does not make a practice of lashing China, nevertheless reports that China continues to commit widespread and well-documented human rights abuses in violation of internationally accepted norms, stemming from the authorities' intolerance of dissent, fear of the unrest, and abuse of laws protecting basic freedoms. The Constitution and laws provide for fundamental human rights, but they are often ignored in practice. Abuses include torture and mistreatment of prisoners, forced confessions, and arbitrary and lengthy detention. Prison conditions remain harsh. The government continues severe restrictions on freedom of speech, the press, assembly association, religion, privacy, and worker rights. All the public dissent against the party and government was effectively silenced by intimidation, exile, the imposition of prison terms, administrative detention, or house arrest. This government must not have gotten the word that capitalism has triumphed over oppressive communism and that people just don't act this way anymore. So why am I concerned about political rights? I'm a good businessman, and I can be amazingly unsentimental when I need to be. I also recognize that when it comes down to it, we can't do much to change a major nation's international policies. Maybe I should do what regular politicians do, overlook principles, ignore human rights, and hope for the best. After all, I do believe that the best thing we can do for backward, oppressive nations is to pull them into the trade matrix, or I rank with many business colleagues and foreign policy gurus, is in my unwillingness to shrug off the mistreatment of China's citizens by their own government. My reason is simple. These oppressive policies make it clear that China's current government has contempt for our way of life. It fears freedom because it knows its survival depends on oppression. It does not respect individual rights. It is still, at heart, a collectivist society. As such, it is a destabilizing force in the world and should be viewed that way. We want to trade with China because of the size of its consumer market. But if the regime continues to repress individuals' freedoms, how many consumers will there really be? Isn't it inconsistent to compromise our principles by negotiating trade with a country that may not want and cannot afford our goods? Yes, we want to help China expand its economic potential, but not because we want to expand markets, but also because a more prosperous society is much harder to oppress. But we don't want to do so at the cost of fairness to ourselves. Our trade with China is more than just a little one-sided. China sells to the U.S. about 4 times what we're allowed to sell in Chinese markets. Our China deals should reflect this wariness, especially in satellite and missile technology, because those deals might severely compromise U.S. security interests. Many of the deals we've already struck may come back to haunt us, but nothing China does seems to shake the faith of the foreign policy experts. They believe that if we just keep giving China almost everything at once, Chinese leadership will eventually see the light. To protect its interest in peace and stability, freedom of the seas, and access to markets in Asia, writes Edwin J. Fulner in the Washington Times, the U.S. must create an environment that encourages China to integrate into the international system as a responsible member. This writer is a conservative, but basically this is the thinking today guiding American policymakers. The Clinton administration, like the Bush administration before it, follows a policy of constructive engagement with China. When China disappoints expectations and ignores lofty lectures, we issue a few condemnations, hammer out some meaningless resolution at the UN, if we can get it by China's UN delegation, and call upon them to comport themselves like citizens of the community of nations. Then we get back to business, as if nothing had happened. How can this policy be working? It isn't. China has been helping itself to top-secret American technology, spying on the American military, supplying nuclear energy to American enemies like Iran and Iraq, threatening American allies like South Korea and Taiwan, breaking one agreement after another, from arms control to copyright protection, compromising Americans' political campaign laws, flooding American markets with cheap goods produced by forced labor, and pouring $80 million a year into a world-class military machine that includes nuclear missiles aimed at America. Sure, we can trust them. Let's look at this very real and almost totally undiscussed military threat. Ask any military thinker what country in the world poses the greatest long-term danger to its neighbors or to America. Ask them what country is arming the fastest and spending the most on its military. Ask them what country is closest to America in its nuclear capability. The answer to all three questions is the People's Republic of China. I recently read the annual assessment of foreign military threats, published by our own Office of Naval Intelligence. This is information more Americans need to be familiar with. In this particular assessment, Iraq, North Korea, and Libya are mentioned almost as an afterthought. Advanced tactical aircraft carriers and destroyers, surface-to-air missiles, nuclear submarines, you name it, and the Chinese are building it. Why? What neighbor of China poses the least threat to its security? Burma? Malaysia? Singapore? There is no getting around the conclusion that China is building a massive defense force well beyond any reasonable regional need. Here's something else to keep in mind. When President Bill Clinton went to Beijing in 1998, the Chinese regime made a big show of announcing that the 13-odd intercontinental missiles it had aimed at the United States would be retargeted elsewhere. The Clinton administration held this out as some sort of big diplomatic triumph. It raised in my mind a simple enough question. Why were those missiles aimed at us in the first place? And more questions, where did they get all the technology to do this? The answer? They got it from us. As I write this, we have just learned that China had a spy planted at Los Alamos. The FBI agents found 50 years' worth of U.S. nuclear secrets squirreled away in the spy's computer. We don't know yet how much of this information he had managed to pass along to China, but it looks grim. Our strategic partner has fleeced us. It's always this way with China. We give the Chinese regime everything they ask for in trade, technology, market access, and cash reserves, and what we hold back, they steal away. In exchange, relatively few American corporations like Boeing, Hughes, and McDonnell Douglas get to compete with Airbus Industry and other European corporations in currying favor for Chinese contracts. But what's in it for the average American? Nothing, especially when our security is threatened. At a UN meeting on human rights not so many years ago, a spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry accused the United States of being a money-bag democracy, all high and mighty in our moral rhetoric, but quick to lay aside principle when there's a profit to be had. I think if we're going to call names, we should return the favor and identify China for what it is: a growing military threat abroad and an oppressive regime at home. And let's not pretend we're dealing with anything less. And let's also operate with the understanding that China doesn't aspire to be a strategic partnership. It sees us as a rival, its ambition to dominate Asia. It sees us as a rival in its ambition to dominate Asia. Our allies in the region, like Japan and South Korea, say nothing of Taiwan. To say nothing of Taiwan, see it that way too. Do they fear China? You better believe they do, and for good reason. Listen to the words of one of China's own military planners in a paper prepared for senior Chinese officials called "Can the Chinese Army Win the Next World War?" It's quoted by reporters Richard Bernstein and Ross Morono in their informative book, The Coming Conflict with China. Well, the conflict of strategic interest between China and the United States was overpowered for a time by the tripartite great power relationship. It is now surfacing steadily since the breakup of the Soviet Union. China and the United States, focused on their respective economic and political interests in the Asia-Pacific region, will remain in a sustained state of confrontation. We have to make it absolutely clear that we're willing to trade with China, but not to trade away our principles, and that under no circumstances will we keep our markets open to countries that steal from us. If that means losing some big contracts to the French or Germans or whomever, so be it. American foreign policy needs to open the doors for American trade, and not the other way around. Principles and national self-interest here speak with the same voice. There are some things more important than profits, and one of them is our own national security. Let's make money in China, but let's do it the smart way.
China is a big country, and we're familiar with viewing foreign policy challenges in terms of large nations, but since the end of the Cold War, we've been forced to deal with a number of smaller enemies who are out of sync with us and with each other. That these nations are small does not mean that they cannot inflict a terrible blow to America. Our foreign policy towards these countries, in fact, often seems designed to elicit such an attack. Instead of one looming crisis hanging over us, we face a bewildering series of smaller crises, flashpoints, standoffs, and hotspots. We're not playing the chess game to end all chess games anymore. We're playing tournament chess, one master against many rivals. One day, we're all assured that Iraq is under control. The UN inspectors have done their work. Everything's fine, not to worry. The next day, the bombing begins. One day we're told that a shadowy figure with no fixed address named Osama bin Laden is public enemy number one, and U.S. jet fighters lay waste to his camp in Afghanistan. He escapes back under some rock, and a few news cycles later, it's on to a new enemy and a new crisis. Take Kosovo. How many Americans could have even found Kosovo on a map before we led NATO into attacking it? Not only was there little warning to the American people of the military campaign to come, there was also hardly any preparation by our own military. We launched the attack without even having our army and fleet in place. Even our president's reason for going in were perfectly sound, it seemed, as though he was trying to divert attention from his personal difficulties. If our military hadn't been so brilliant, we could have been in deep trouble in Kosovo. Excellent air power, miserable democracy. Miserable diplomacy. There's something haphazard, impulsive, and unpredictable about American foreign policy today. Don't feel bad if you're having trouble following world events. Your government can't keep up with them either. Dealing with many different countries at once may require many different strategies, but there isn't any excuse for the haphazard nature of our foreign policy. We don't have to reinvent the wheel for every new conflict. Yes, the world is much different than it was even a decade ago. Yes, we do face multiple threats we didn't face before, but this isn't to say we are walking in the dark. Instead, we know who and what the threats are. The problem is that we're totally mishandling them. North Korea and other rogues, China, is our biggest long-term challenge. But in the short term, the biggest menace is North Korea. North Korean exports exactly one thing to the rest of the world: trouble. Just about anywhere in America, it's threatened by terrorists, by the spread of nuclear weapons and missile technology. You name it. We can count on the folks in Pyongyang to have a hand in it. This is no secret. So you have to wonder why our policy towards North Korea is so weak-minded. This is an example of our inability to come up with reasonable policies, even when we know exactly where the potential threat is. We know that our adversaries in North Korea are making weapons of mass destruction. We also know that they will use them, if possible, because they detest everything about us. So what do? We blink. In fact, we blink so much, it looks as though we're asleep. President Clinton has rightly taken some heat on this. But let's be honest, most of our political leadership shares the blame because, as usual, most of our politicians and pundits are too busy looking at the rainbow to notice the dark clouds moving in. After we discovered that North Korea was working overtime to build an arsenal of nuclear weapons, Washington demanded the North Koreans allow an inspection of reprocessing facilities by officials of the International Atomic Energy Agency. Remember, this is the remaining superpower telling North Korea, which is weak, starving, and isolated, to let an international body inspect a serious facility. North Koreans' response? No way. They finally agreed to what is called the Agreed Framework, which they signed on October 21st, 1994, and it was immediately hailed by the Clinton administration as diplomacy at its best. You be the judge. We promised them 2 nuclear reactors at $4 billion each, up to 500,000 metric tons of fuel oil every year until the reactors come online, and food for North Koreans' masses. In return,
North Korea, which is probably the last truly Stalinist regime on Earth, promised to halt construction of 2 Soviet-type reactors, suspend refueling its existing reactor, and allow inspection of spent fuel rods which can be used to make nuclear weapons. North Korea knew that we were bluffing. To no one's surprise, a U.S. satellite later found that a large underground complex was being built near the existing nuclear center. This was a huge operation, bigger than similar facilities in Libya, Iraq, and the former Soviet Union. Just to rub our noses in it, they launched a long-range missile a month later. This would have not happened if we'd been tough from the start. Nor did other adversaries fail to draw this conclusion. Uncle Sam is a sap. It was one more example of how far out of the way we will go to avoid confrontation on political threats. Our enemies learn we don't mean what we say. After we warned China that we would come down hard if they attacked Taiwan, Lieutenant General Zhang Guangkai, Deputy Chief of China's General Staff, responded, "No, you won't. We watched you in Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, and you don't have the will." Iraq saw what happened in North Korea and stifled our weapons inspectors. Here is the fundamental difference between Donald Trump and our current crop of political wannabes, of presidential wannabes. I do have the will. Does anyone seriously doubt that North Korea is up to no good? Here you have a pitiful nation whose people are starving to death, which has nonetheless undertaken an immense nuclear program. When a country this size builds an underground facility bigger than those found in the old Soviet Union, they're serious. So serious is North Korea's leadership that it will clearly risk rebellion by starving masses in order to build weapons of mass destruction. As even the most treacherous dictator knows, a starving population can easily become every bit as dangerous as an invading army. But still they build, which can only mean one thing. This isn't nuclear defense, deterrence on their part. These people want to use these weapons if at all possible. Some experts believe they may be close to developing launch systems that could deposit a warhead on our shores, which would certainly threaten U.S. bases and allies. And we're building nuclear light water reactors for them. In reality, North Korea today has the means to do us tremendous damage. Our current deal with Korea, a case study in stupidity, has had the usual effect. In August 1998, for example, the people of Japan noticed a strange light passing overhead. North Korea claimed it had been sent a music satellite aloft in celebration of the communist regime's 50th anniversary and the formal installation of Kim Jong-il, the creepy son of the late tyrant Kim Il-sung. It turned out to be a multi-stage nuclear ballistic rocket, a test demonstrating that North Korea now has the technology to devastate mainland Japan. That's bad enough. Now listen to this. Former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, a tough, no-nonsense businessman and exceptionally able public servant, was appointed head of a commission to assess the missile threat abroad. One conclusion of the study: North Korea's ongoing nuclear program activity raises the possibility that it could also produce additional nuclear weapons. North Korea also possesses biological weapons production and dispensing technology, including the capability to deploy chemical or biological warheads on missiles. Here we have a commission of military and intelligence experts appointed by the President and Congress to assess the danger of attack from abroad, telling us that despite all our diplomatic efforts and some arms control agreements, our worst enemy today has the means to attack America and our allies. Worse, we won't even have warning. It is unlikely, concluded the Rumsfeld Commission, the U.S. would know of such a decision to attack us before the missile was launched. The missile could reach major cities and military bases in Alaska and the smaller westernmost lands in the Hawaiian chain. American reaction and diplomacy has been just the opposite of common sense. We essentially seek to buy off the North Koreans by lifting certain economic sanctions in order for a temporary freeze on testing of their nuclear missiles. The Economist called our policy acquiescence. The economists call our policy acquaintance in serial bribery. Former Secretary of State James A. Baker III, a cagey guy I admire, called the agreement appeasement. And he was absolutely right. Our North Korean policy is not only bad in and of itself, it's also a green light to every desperate, angry, brainwashed dictator in every miserable, poor, collective state in the world. It completely ignores every major policy lesson of the last century. When we are resolute, as Roosevelt and Reagan were, we win. When we are ambitious and ambiguous and soft, we absolutely invite attack. What would I do in North Korea? Fair question. It's easy to point out the problem, but what should we do to solve it? Am I ready to bomb this reactor? You're damn right. When the Israelis bombed the Iraqi nuclear reactor, they were condemned by the world community. But what they did to survive. The North Korean nuclear capability is a direct threat to the United States. As an experienced negotiator, I can tell you that negotiation with these madmen would be fruitless once they have the ability to lob a nuclear missile into Chicago, Los Angeles, or New York. I don't advocate a thermonuclear war, but if negotiations fail, I advocate a surgical strike against these outlaws before they pose a real threat. Let me be precise and clear. I remember what happened to Barry Goldwater when he advocated the use of nuclear weapons to de-escalate the jungles in Vietnam. And I want there to be no media distortion or misunderstanding about my views. I'm not trigger happy, nor would I consider the use of force lightly. But as president, I would be prepared to order a strike using conventional weapons against North Korean targets if it prevented nuclear blackmail or the nuclear destruction of the U.S. population. I'm not talking about an extended air campaign against North Korea, and certainly not ground war. I'm talking about taking out a very specific target and then returning to the bargain table. I am advocating such an action only after talks break down, which is highly likely in view of the North Koreans' track record of violating everything they have agreed to thus far. Doesn't it make at least as much sense to take out these truly threatening facilities as it does to blow up buildings and bridges in downtown Belgrade, Yugoslavia? It would be much smarter to remove a political threat, a potential threat to this country, than to get involved in a civil war in the Balkans, which pose no threat whatsoever to our national security. We can learn something here from George Bush and see how good a president was. He wasn't afraid to use American power when he figured out that Saddam Hussein posed a threat only to American interests in the East. I only wish, however, that he had spent 3 more days and properly finished the job. It is this kind of will and determination to use our strength strategically that America needs again to deal with the North Koreans. A surgical strike would not only put out fire in North Korea, but it would also send a message around the world that the U.S. is going to eliminate any serious threat to its security, and do so without apology. What's going to complain? Who's going to complain besides China, which is far too interested in trade expansion to do anything more than perfunctory grousing? Or are we afraid that we might upset Fidel Castro or Iraq? The only thing that unites the people who oppose such an operation is that they are all non-democratic regimes who hate the United States because it represents the antithesis of their own rotten, corrupt, impoverished police states. Are we going to walk their line or ours? When I advocated the possibility of a surgical strike against the North Koreans on Meet the Press, moderator Tim Russert asked me about the possibility that nuclear fallout might pollute Asia as a consequence of our taking action. Russert quoted a former Secretary of Defense saying that a surgical strike was not an option for this reason. After all, Israel attacked a similar facility in Iraq with no fallout. Within days of the Meet the Press broadcast, I had 2 phone calls from officers very high up in our military who both assured me, off the record, that such a strike could be successful. Because both men are still on active duty, neither one wants to be identified. The fact is, if we practiced a principled and tough policy towards this and other outlaw states, we won't even be in this situation. Even when we finally decide to go after a rogue state, we often stop well short of finishing the job. Consider Iraq. After each pounding from U.S. warplanes, Iraq has dusted itself off and gone right back to work developing a nuclear arsenal. 6 years of tough talk and U.S. fireworks in Baghdad have done little to slow Iraq's crash program to become a nuclear power. They've got missiles capable of flying 900 kilometers, more than enough to reach Tel Aviv. They've got enough enriched uranium. All they need is the material for nuclear fission to complete the job, and according to the Rumsfeld report, we don't even know for sure if they've laid their hands on that yet. That's what our last aerial assault on Iraq in 1999 was all about. Saddam Hussein wouldn't let UN weapons inspectors examine certain sites where that material might be stored. The result, when our bombing was over, we still didn't know what Iraq was up to or whether it has the material to build nuclear weapons. I'm no warmonger, but the fact is, if we decide a strike against Iraq is necessary, it is madness not to carry the mission to its conclusion. When we don't, we have the worst of all worlds. Iraq remains a threat, and now has more incentive than ever to attack the U.S. Am I being contradictory here by presenting myself as a deal maker and then recommending a preemptive strike? I don't think so. There's nothing really comparable to unleashing a squadron of bombers, but in the world of business, sometimes you have to make quick, secret, decisive moves in order to gain a negotiating advantage. I've done so a number of times in getting around the objections of would-be landmarks, preservation people, in gaining the advantage in trying to secure air rights or a piece of property. Von Clausewitz also said that war is a continuation of political relations, a carrying out of the same by other means. That makes a lot of sense to me. Iran is even further ahead of the game than is Iraq. Within 5 years, Iran is expected to have nuclear missiles capable of reaching the continental United States. Like North Korea, China, and Iraq, they've been importing crucial parts and technical assistance from Russia. Today, the world's nuclear Walmart, even as the U.S. has tried to save Russia from collapse with loans and IMF bailouts and political support, Russia has become the world's leading exporter of weapons of mass destruction to America's enemies. Being there for Israel, the United States must continue to nurture and safeguard our special relationship with the State of Israel. This relationship must remain the cornerstone of our policy tactics through the Middle Eastern region, as it has been for presidential administrations of both parties for more than half a century. Why do we have this special relationship? Is it not out of charity, guilt, or what some call or what some who would attack these bonds have called the political pressure of ethnic lobbies? We have been there for Israel, as for England, because Israel is there for us. Israel is a stable, democratic ally in a region filled with instability and dictatorship. It is an unsinkable aircraft carrier for America's interests and values. From the United Nations to the Mediterranean. Now, as Israel has matured, our close ties also bring America a fair trading partner and a fellow pioneer on the high-tech frontier of medicine and communications that will enrich Americans' lives in the coming century. Our two countries must continue to stand strong together as pillars of freedom and progress, rehabilitating Russia. In a way, one has to feel sorry for Russia. It is like an old business, a professional adversary who falls on hard times, loses his house, his wife, his money, starts drinking, and is found one day in the gutter. Natural human sympathy makes you want to get this guy back on his feet, clean him up, give him a few bucks, and hope for the best. Our dealings with Russia are, of course, much more complicated. In some ways, they are even more complicated than they ever were. There are serious debates among foreign policy experts about who is even running Russia, how much power the Russian military experts, and whether Russia's elected government can control the sale and export of its nuclear technology. These became urgent questions in late 1998 when the rubble hit the floor and it was unclear that the government would survive. They'll become very urgent questions soon. Count on it. What I don't understand is why American policymakers are always so timid in dealing with Russia on issues that directly involved our survival. Kuskava was a perfect case in point. Russia was holding out its hand for billions of dollars in IMF loans to go along with the billions in aid the U.S. had already given, the same week that it was issuing threats and warnings regarding our conduct in the Balkans. Imagine if you were at a bank, and while your loan officer was reviewing your application for funds, you took the opportunity to berate him on some unrelated matter. That's basically what Russia was doing. A lot of countries do the same thing. They rely on our generosity on the one hand, while undermining us on the other. We need to tell Russia and other recipients that if they want our dime, they had better do our dance, at least in matters regarding our national security. These people need us as much as we need them. We have leverage, and we are crazy not to use it to our better advantage. Few respect weakness. Ultimately, we have to deal with hostile nations in the only language they know, unshrinking conviction and military power to back it up, if need be. There and in that order are America's two greatest assets in foreign affairs. Either we believe in ourselves or we don't. Whenever we involve ourselves abroad, we had better do so with confidence. No more of this Clinton-esque apologizing for America and its exercise of authority. Reagan had confidence, and the world respected him for it. They knew he meant business. Today, it seems, we do everything half-heartedly, unsure of ourselves, even in the use of military power, as in Iraq and the Balkans. Better to do nothing at all. As Theodore Roosevelt put it at the beginning of this century, a milk and water righteousness unbacked by force is as wicked as, and even more mischievous than force divorced from righteousness. In Cuba, Fidel Castro was a thorn in our side, even before the time, nearly 40 years ago, that he advanced an attack on us by the Soviet Union during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's run a nasty and vicious little dictatorship, caused immense suffering to his people, and he talks way too much. American policy towards Cuba makes no sense. For 30 years, Castro has oppressed his people and exported terrorism to Central and South America, as well as bolstered Soviet troops in Angola. What Castro has done to Cuban society is disgraceful. Terror reigns, the secret police unrestrained, beatings and citizen disappearances are common, and all free expression outside the Communist Party is crushed. Our program has been to isolate Castro and put extreme economic pressure on him, which candidly did not work well, because Castro was receiving enormous financial subsidies from his Soviet patrons. With the fall of the Soviet Union, however, hard economic times have hit. Castro's Cuba with a vengeance. The socialist utopia that Castro built has insignificant food, water, electricity, gasoline, rubber, and even lacks everyday commodities such as soap. And more important, the military class that kept Castro in power and previously had access to luxury housing, gasoline, and other amenities is now feeling the economic pinch. Clearly, Castro is squeezed as never before and is desperate for hard American dollars to bolster his foundering socialist experiment. Some would say that we now have Castro on the edge of the cliff, and now is the time to push him over. After these many years, the economic squeeze has worked. That's why I like Senator Bob Torricelli of New Jersey. Although a liberal Democrat, Torricelli is realistic about the dangers of a communist dictator 90 miles from our shores and has been an outspoken leader in the efforts to tighten the screws on Castro through economic embargo. Incredibly, however, the reaction of the Clinton State Department is exactly the opposite. Now they tell us is the time to normalize relations with Cuba and eventually bail Fidel out financially. Nothing could be more wrong. We like to believe that investment abroad can raise the living standards of third world people. In Cuba, foreign investors are not allowed to hire or pay Cuban workers. They must pay the government directly for the workers. Castro then pays the workers token salaries in worthless Cuban money and keeps the rest. Under these circumstances, my investment could not help average Cubans. It could only replace the Cuban subsidy Castro no longer receives. If, for example, I opened a casino or hotel in Havana, I would be required to pay Castro about $10,000 per year for each Cuban worker, but the workers would not benefit. Castro would pay them the equivalent of $10 a month. The rest he'd use to pay for the brutal and violent system that keeps him in power and deprives the Cuban people of basic human rights. In other words, my investment in Cuba would directly subsidize the oppression of the Cuban people. I might make millions of dollars, but I'd rather lose millions than lose my self-respect. We have to be careful not to fall into the kind of dilemma created by Castro and other parts of the world. I have noted with interest the efforts of the Spanish to extradite former right-wing Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet to stand trial for murder and terrorism. Pinochet is no angel, but his crimes pale in comparison to the reign of terror unleashed by Castro. In my book, what's good for the right-wing dictators is good for the left-wing dictators, but you don't have to hear the human rights type screaming for Castro's extradition. That's exactly what I propose. The first time Castro leaves Cuba for any nation that we have extradition treaties with, he should be detained, arrested, and extradited to the United States for indictment and trial on charges of murder and terrorism. This seems like a much more intelligent course than sending an exploding cigar, as the CIA did in the 1950s. Fidel is a criminal. Let's treat him that way. I was asked to write my views on Fidel Castro for the Miami Herald in June of 1999. I said in part that I understood the arguments for lifting the Cuban embargo. The Cold War is over. Castro is on the ropes. Pumping money into his economy would benefit the long-suffering masses. This is the way some people argue. To open up Cuba, export democracy. This is how to promote entrepreneurship and independence from the state. Each of those arguments is fucking bogus. Cuba will be freed by ideas, not by rampacious businessmen lining Castro's pockets and propping up his oppressive regime. Though the Cold War is indeed over, it would be instructive to remember the role that Castro played in the struggle between, yes, good and evil. He turned the island over to his Soviet patrons. He was quite willing to have nuclear missiles launched from Cuban soil that would have destroyed American cities. He exported revolution to Central and South America and even to Africa. He abetted Libyan terrorism. He gave asylum into a maximum security prison. He gave asylum to murderers. Even worse, he turned his nation into a maximum security prison. His regime controls every aspect of human life. Access to food, medical assistance, schools, and employment. Castro has not mellowed with age. Terror continues to reign. The secret police are unrestrained. The disappearance and beatings of citizens are still tools for civilization control. As if the suppression of free speech, Castro's ruthless domination of the Cuban people is not lessened, even as his regime crumbles. When I wrote in the Miami Herald about my views regarding Cuba and Fidel Castro, I was overwhelmed by the response of the Cuban American community. In South Florida, I literally received thousands of cards, letters, emails, fax mails, and emails from both Cuban leaders and average Cuban American citizens. Among these letters was one I was particularly pleased about. It was from Jorge Mas Santos, the chairman of the Cuban American National Foundation, and the son of Jorge Mas Canosa, the Cuban American patriot who spearheaded opposition to Castro in the U.S. by making sure Americans clearly understood the true nature of the Cuban Gulag. Jorge Mas Santos, who succeeded his father as chairman of the Cuban American National Foundation, is carrying on this tradition of effectiveness on behalf of those who want to return to Cuba to freedom and democracy. Jorge Mas invited me to Miami for a reception in my honor, sponsored by the Cuban American National Foundation. I was pleased to accept and envisioned a ceremony with 10 or 15 community leaders.
Instead, thousands of people turned out. Not just affluent Cuban-American professionals, but average citizens, too. Janitors, seamstresses, housekeepers, and working people who yearn for the return of liberty in their homeland. Later, I was asked by the Wall Street Journal to write an op-ed article outlining my priorities as president. In speaking about Cuba, I said that I would immediately reverse the move to normalize relations with Castro, calling him the most abnormal political figure in our hemisphere. As I said, we have pushed him to the precipice with our embargo, helped again by the withdrawal of Soviet backing. Now comes a moment, backed by State Department bureaucrats, to rescue Mr. Castro with U.S. dollars. Normalization is pure lunacy. Again, I said that if a right-wing leader like Augusto Pinochet can be extradited and tried for his crimes against humanity, the same treatment should be accorded to Mr. Castro. 2 days later, former Connecticut Governor Lorwell Wickler told the American Reform Party conference in Washington that one of his highest priorities, if he were elected president on the Reform Party ticket, would be to immediately normalize the relations with Cuba's Castro. What soft-headed liberals like Wickler fail to understand, as I said in the Miami Herald, is that economic infusion of capital into Cuba only flows to the government, not to the people. Wickler said that Radio Marti funding should be cut and the program canceled. He's dead wrong. It is vital that the people of Cuba know what things are really like in the United States, get some glimmer of how life in a democracy works, and recognize that the anti-American rhetoric that has kept Castro in power for 40 years is merely propaganda. I say we export ideas by expanding communication with the Cuban people. The technical advances of this century make it possible for Castro to shut out the outside world. In the end, it is the truth that will set the Cuban people free. Blockhead's Guide to Foreign Policy. Humanitarian concerns, which are sometimes represented as working in our national interests, are not good enough reasons in themselves for deployment of forces. Fact 1. We don't have a dog in most of the world's dogfights. That's not to say our hearts don't go out to people whose countries are being ravaged by war. Far from it. Our hearts do go out to them, and so does a lot of U.S. humanitarian aid. But we have no business, and certainly no right, to intervene in conflicts just because we don't like to see innocent people being killed or dislocated. Just after we started bombing the European capital of Belgrade, a poll came out saying that a majority of Americans thought it was our right to get into this long-standing and bloody dispute. I disagree. Like everyone else, I am horrified when I see people mistreating, oppressing, or murdering others. I have been extremely depressed at what has happened in Africa. My heart is with those people because so many of them are powerless and have been swept up in wars that are horrendously bloody by comparison to the wars we see in contemporary Europe, where we seem especially prone to sticking to our noses. If you believe in the human family, you cannot look at contemporary Africa without feeling a little deal of anguish. Yet it should be clear by now that when we do intervene in these conflicts, we do little more than temporarily tilt the balance of power. Sometimes, as it was in the Balkan mess, we're allies with one side for a while, then shift our support to the other side. In the first place, we don't have any idea of how to build democracies in these countries, even if such a thing were possible or desired by them. To top it off, we are deploying troops at the same time we are cutting defense expenditures. None of this makes one bit of sense. All we know how to do is make a show of our outrage, and even then, we are likely to botch the operation. The point was made perfectly in Somalia. We made a big splash coming in, but quickly realized we were in the quagmire of intranational hostilities. We were in the quagmire of intranational hostilities that we could do nothing to settle. The tragedy was compounded by the loss of American lives, after which we quickly lost interest in the Somali cause and beat an undignified retreat. The debacle hurt our international standing. My rules of engagement are pretty simple. If we are going to intervene in a conflict, it had better pose a direct threat to our interest. One definition of direct being a threat so obvious that most Americans will know where the hotspot is on the globe and will quickly understand why we are getting involved. The threat should be so direct that our leaders, including our president, should be able to make the case clearly and concisely, which has not been the case regarding the terrible events in Yugoslavia. Make no mistake, I love the American desire to help others. The American public will give the disadvantaged money and aid with no exception, with no expectation of return. They simply give because they know it is the right thing to do. We are the greatest of all humanitarian nations, and at the same time, we must not get involved in a long festering conflict for humanitarian reasons. If that's our standard, we should have troops stationed all over Africa and much of Asia as well. We will provide humanitarian assistance, but when our men and women volunteer in our armed forces, it should be with the strict understanding that they will be sent into danger's way only in cases where our national survival is directly affected. Young people now enlist, thinking they're signing up to protect America, and end up responding to a palace coup in a country few have ever heard of. I'm not an isolationist, but neither am I one of those giddy globalists who think that we should leave everything to the IMF and the UN.
We're not the world's savior. That job is taken, but there are some things we can do, and we shouldn't shy away from doing them. However, it is essential that we sort out those areas where we have a national interest from those where do we not. In the Middle East, America must stand by our only ally in the region, the State of Israel. Not only is Israel strategically important in terms of the world's oil supply, but it is also the only democracy in the Middle East. Check Israel's voting record at the United Nations. The Soviet Union is no longer a threat to our Western European allies. America has no vital interest in choosing between warring factions whose animosities go back centuries in Eastern Europe. Their conflicts are not worth American lives. Pulling back from Europe would save this country millions of dollars annually. The cost of stationing NATO troops in Europe is enormous, and those are clearly funds that can be put to better use. Our allies don't seem to appreciate our presence anyway. We pay for the defense of France, yet they vote against us at the UN and choose the sides of the North Koreans, the Libyans, and other rogue nations. But ultimately, I don't think that we should abandon Europe completely. Pat Buchanan has made headlines for a book in which he says that the Allies did not need to go to war against the Third Reich because Hitler's ambitions were modest. He would have been happy to simply conquer Eastern Europe so the German people would have elbow room and would have left the rest of the world alone. Buchanan's position seems to come from that weird cloud cuckoo land where left and right meet each other. His recommendation of appeasement towards the Nazi regime sounds exactly like what liberals said about Hitler in the 1930s, and what liberals today are saying about rogue states like North Korea. If you apply the same type of doctrine of appeasement to domestic criminals, you'd be giving murderers and armed robbers stern reprimands and setting them free. Immigration, protecting our own. There's another area of foreign affairs that doesn't get talked about very much, but it is a huge issue. Immigration. America is experiencing serious social and economic difficulty with illegal immigrants who are flooding across our borders. 5 million illegals live in this country. 2 million of them live in California. 700,000 undocumented immigrants live in Texas. We simply can't absorb them. It is a scandal when America cannot control its own borders. Immigrant advocacy groups have no business rising up in protest, demanding special rights, services, and privileges. We can't allow ourselves to welcome outsiders to our shores out of kindness. If people enter this country by disregarding our laws, can we be confident that they will suddenly become law-abiding citizens once they arrive? A liberal policy of immigration may seem to reflect confidence and generosity, but our current laxness towards illegal immigration shows a recklessness and disregard for those who live here legally. The majority of legal immigrants can often make significant contributions to our society because they have special skills and because they add to our nation's cultural diversity. They come with the best of intentions. The United States admitted 900,000 new legal immigrants in 1996, 195,000 more than the year before. About a fifth of these people came from Mexico, and more than half of them came from Latin America, with most of the balance coming from Asia and Africa. Along with them came 100,000 or so refugees, some 40% of them from republics of the former Soviet Union, and the rest from various other troubled regions of the world. Statistics like these have a lot of people worried. Though overall, there has been a marked decline in legal immigration since 1990. Legal immigrants do not and should not enter easily. They have to wait years and go through a lot of aggravation. Go into your local INS office sometime. It's a long, costly, draining, and often frustrating ordeal by design. People who immigrated here really want it. I say to legal immigrants, welcome and good luck. But let's be extremely careful not to admit more people than we can absorb. It comes down to this. We must take care of our own people first. Our policy to people born elsewhere should be clear. Enter by law or leave. And as it happens, deportation of illegal immigrants has lately been stepped up. More than 1 million deportable aliens were apprehended in 1996, and 37,000 criminal aliens were packed off back to where they came from. But it's still not good enough. It's irresponsible to give a helping hand to outsiders so long as there is one American deprived of a livelihood or basic service. International trade. You only have to look at our trade International trade. You only have to look at our trade deficit to see that we are being taken to the cleaners by our trading partners. We need tougher negotiations, not protectionist walls around America. We need to ensure that foreign markets in Japan and France and Germany and Saudi Arabia are open to our products as our country is to theirs. Our long-term interests require that we cut better deals with our world trading partners. This will raise an outcry because we've fallen into the habit of mistaking the easy availability of cheap sweatshop-produced products for solid and substantial economic stability. America has been ripped off by virtually every country we do business with. We need to renegotiate fair trade agreements. I would put the right people in charge of negotiation and would get myself involved. If President Trump does the negotiating, we'll get a better deal for American workers and their families, and our economy will not be as vulnerable to global pressures as it is today. Watch our trade deficit dwindle. Our government has a U.S. trade representative. This important job has cabinet rank. You really have to wonder what our trade representative has been doing for the last 7 years. What would I do if elected president? To appoint myself U.S. trade representative. My lawyers have checked, and the president has this authority to make himself the U.S. trade representative. I would take personal charge of negotiations with the Japanese, the French, the Germans, and the Saudis. Our trading partners would have to sit across the table from Donald Trump, and I agree you, the rip-off of the United States would end. The American people would benefit in 2 ways. I'd lower our trade deficits, and I'd save the salary of our U.S. trade representative because I wouldn't accept it. It's become a cliche to say that business, especially trade, is like war. Many successful books on business have approached the subject that way. But cliche or not, it's true. Germany and Japan were our enemies in World War II, and for decades afterwards, each was a powerful competitor in trade, tough in peacetime, as each had been in war. Though both have fallen on lean times recently, they will become worthy adversaries again. We didn't make the best possible trade deals with them. We're not making smart deals now. I've pointed out the immense mistake we're making in our dealings with North Korea and other rogue states. The core of these problems is that we don't know how to negotiate. We don't know how to get what we want out of the people we're sitting across the table from. There was a time in the mid-'80s, for example, when the Japanese were overfishing the Pacific. By combining forces and laying down the line, other fishing nations prevailed.
the Japanese stopped using their large nets, giving opportunities to fishermen and other nations, and more important, protecting the environment. You have to know how to be firm, just firm enough, and how to persist and persist and persist until you get what you want and get close to the terms you want. Though we defeated them in war, in peacetime, we were never successful in dealing with Japanese governments, which were unstable, or their banks, which were the biggest in the world. Despite their current difficulties, the Japanese still outdo us in the production of cars, and the Germans are still actively buying up U.S. companies. There are all kinds of opportunities out there. The chaotic nations of the former Soviet Union, a potentially rich, repressive China, an economically united Europe with great potential. But we have to know not only what we want, but how to get what we want, how to make our moves, how to sit still. Politicians hate confrontation because they can't afford to make enemies. They never stop campaigning. In 1992, in my book Surviving at the Top, I proposed a committee of leading public figures, corporate leaders, and deal makers to sit on a panel that would realign our economic and political relationships with the world. It's still a good idea. Even a one-term president who knew how to make a deal could get this country's trade and foreign affairs in order in a way that would last for a long, long time. Frankly, there are many aspects of trade where my negotiating skills could be useful. Speak softly. At the beginning of this century, Theodore Roosevelt approached both domestic and foreign battles guided by the West African phrase, speak softly and carry a big stick. It's still a good MO today. We need to begin shaping events instead of waiting for events to shape our policies. 4 months before the Serb army moved into Kosovo, there was a summary purging off Serbian generals on record as opposing the invasion. What should that have told us? We were negotiating with the Serbs, trying to talk them out of their threats to occupy Kosovo. And when they made good on those threats, we weren't even ready. I'm delighted that there was a happy ending in Kosovo, but it could have very easily gone otherwise. You can learn a lot from a near miss. It was the same story in May of 1997 when Americans picked up their newspapers to learn that Pakistan had just tested a nuclear weapon, prompting India to stage a similar test a few days later. Pakistan? Nuclear weapons? We had no clue it was coming. Our own intelligence services learned of the test only when it showed up on seismic monitors. Even the Rumsfeld Commission, in its assessment of the threat from North Korea, Iran, and Iraq, admitted it was relying partly on guesswork. What does this tell you about future threats? Here we are, the lone superpower in the world, and yet we find ourselves taken by surprise in matters concerning our own most vital interests. If we don't address this intelligence gap immediately, our foreign policy will always be reactive. I've learned in the business world that bluster gets you exactly nowhere. Under the Clinton administration, our foreign policy leaders talk too much, endlessly, nonstop, around the clock. If following some secret strategy to bore our enemies into submission, this administration makes threat after threat after threat, even when they actually carry out a threat, they are once again in front of the cameras, explaining and announcing and issuing still more threats, warnings, and condemnations. When I do a multi-billion-dollar business deal, I never tell my competitors what I will and will not do. To tell the enemy we're not going to invade defies common sense. It conveys weakness, lack of discipline, incoherence, and a lack of confidence in our objectives. That lack of confidence may reflect another troubling reality: our diminished military forces. To wage our aerial assault on Yugoslavia, we had to call upon U.S. forces from all points of the globe, from the Persian Gulf to the Pacific. Why? Because we're spread too thin. The United States last year spent about 3% of gross domestic product maintaining our military forces, or about $250 billion. Compare that with past figures. Defense spending in the last year of the Carter administration came to 4.9% of GDP. During the Reagan buildup, it was 6.5% of GDP. U.S. defense spending, in other words, is half of what it was as a percentage of GDP.
We are still living off the Reagan military buildup of nearly 20 years ago. 75% of our Air Force planes have been in service for 20 years or longer. The question is, what will we live off of 10 or 15 years from now if we do not invest again now? You can't pursue forward military and foreign policy objectives on a backward military budget. I'm not advocating that America go forth and police the world. Far from it. I'm just saying that if we're going to use our military power abroad, as we are today, we had better make sure that power is ready to be used. The high price of peace. We definitely must find funding for defense, which means somebody is going to come up with less money for their own project. My suggestion is going to rankle some of my more conservative friends, but I think the best place is to start by diverting money from the planned missile defense system. I know this sounds almost counterintuitive, because a missile defense system is supposed to help us defend against attack by rogue states to begin with. I'm not laughing at missile defense, and I never have. A lot of people laugh when Ronald Reagan said he announced what detractors pegged as Star Wars. Reagan is crazy, they insisted, but it's clear now that he was crazy like a fox. The Soviets definitely believed we could build such a system, and the threat of one protecting our cities put them in a much more compromising mood.
It convinced them that they were not going to be able to continue competing with the U.S. military because we had moved too far ahead in technology. Now, even the earlier detractors believe such a system is possible, and the president says he sees the time coming when we will need such a system. The question isn't whether or not such a defense can be built. The question is whether it is the right defense for our times, and I believe the answer is largely no. Yes, outlaw regimes like Libya, North Korea, or Syria might eventually develop missile capability, though with better intelligence and the will to act when necessary, we can counter those threatening developments. But in this age of miniaturization, our real threat is not going to be flying in on a missile. It's going to be delivered in a van, or a suitcase, or a fire hydrant-sized canister. I'll discuss that threat in the next chapter. We're a nation of industrious, creative, and diligent people, and we deserve what we've made for ourselves. Like everyone else in this country, I vastly prefer a soft soda to a bed of nails, a soft sofa to a bed of nails. At the same time, there's no doubt in my mind that Americans would vastly prefer knowing what challenges lie ahead and waking up one morning to the horror of an unforeseen crisis. We can't command the world to go exactly our way, but we can shape events to a degree that is unmatched amongst other nations. Our first challenge is to insist that our political leaders and opinion makers start making these issues central to the national conversation. Yes, I know that many of them will say that Americans aren't interested in foreign affairs. The television people will complain that if a story isn't sexy enough or violent enough, no one will watch. Believe me, once you make it clear how male violent our adversaries are and exactly what their weapons can do to our children, you'll have everyone's attention. And it couldn't come a moment too soon. Chapter 5 will be called Freedom and Terrorism. Chapter 5, Freedom from Terrorism. You think that terrorism isn't a problem in this country? All right. So you want to discount the nutcase terrorism that's been going on here at least since the assassination of JFK, lone gunman terrorism. Or maybe you want a definition of terrorism that doesn't cover the high school killers or Buford Furrow, the white supremacist loser who drove to Los Angeles so he could shoot up a Jewish daycare center. Perhaps you'd like to ignore the mystery figure who blew up 8 people in a Texas church, apparently because he needed to express some deep-seated hatred of Baptists. Political terrorism? Not here. Read the papers. Only a couple of months ago, President Clinton gave clemency to 11 members of a Puerto Rican terrorist gang who had served 19 years in jail. They were responsible for 130 bombings, many of them in bars and restaurants, resulting in 6 people dead and many more maimed. At least one of those kills was a police officer. He was a father of 2 small sons. But we were told these freedom fighters had disavowed violence. Jimmy Carter said so. Desmond Tutu said so.
and probably the release would help Hillary's Senate campaign amongst Puerto Rican voters in New York. One of the leaders of the terrorist group, Ricardo Jimenez, was interviewed on Meet the Press. He was asked by moderator Tim Russert if his group had really been so non-violent. Given their mode of operation, Russert wanted to know, isn't there a pretty strong possibility that innocent people are going to be hurt and killed? No, Jimenez said. I think all precautions were taken, to make sure that all human life was preserved. And in the end, measures were not taken that were necessary by the people that own these establishments. In other words, the death and maimings could be blamed on the people who owned or managed the places where the bombs went off. It's an outrage. Clearly, these Puerto Rican leaders have neither renounced violence nor expressed any remorse for their actions. It is almost beyond belief that President Clinton, for the sake of his wife's Senate campaign, would release those murderers in order to pander for a few votes in the Puerto Rican community. The Clintons tell us they never discussed the matter and that Hillary's campaign was not a consideration. Do you believe them? I don't. Hillary's attempt to distance herself from the disastrous decision only compounded the matter. This is Clinton at his ham-handed worst. Ham-handed worst. Let's take a lesson from this incident. Let's pay attention to the warning given by this anti-colonist Jimenez. Let's mind our own stores, restaurants, houses, schools, and churches. Because if we don't, there'll be more acts of terrorism. I may be making waves, but that's all right. Making waves is usually what you need to do to rock the boat, and our national security boat definitely needs rocking. Let's point fingers. The biggest threat to our security is ourselves, because we become arrogant, dangerously arrogant. It's time for a realistic view of the world and our place in it. Do we truly understand the threats we face? And let me give this warning. You won't hear a lot of what follows from candidates in this campaign, because what I've got to say is definitely not happy talk. There are forces to be worried about, people and programs to take action against now. When we talk about foreign policy, we're talking about the governments of foreign countries. We face a different problem when we talk about the individual fanatics who want to harm us. As my father always said, when you're on the top, you've got a lot of people gunning for you. That's basic human nature. The little guy wants to topple the big guy. This attitude has taken more than a few from nowhere to the top, and the world loves an underdog, at least in principle. Many of the world's populations are made up of underdogs who have big teeth and very nasty attitudes. Millions of people around the globe hate everything about the United States. They don't like Wall Street, Main Street, 2 cars in your garage, or any other aspect of our national prosperity. They don't like the Constitution. They don't like the Bill of Rights. They don't believe in freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, except their own, or the freedom to be left alone. They believe that democracy is corrupt, not only in practice, but in principle. Democracy represents diversity. These people think that they've got the one true answer about everything. But their greatest displeasure is reserved for our popular culture. They hate everything about it. Miniskirts, Mardi Gras, Mickey Mouse, the corner bar, cable television, working women, women who drive cars, Hollywood, Las Vegas, Atlantic City, Sunset Strip, the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders, the Bud Bowl, ABC, CBS, NBC, CNN, and MTV. And that's just a short list. Some of our adversaries despise all of this because they want it, and they know they'll never get it. But others truly believe our culture is evil. We can kid ourselves all we want by mocking their references to the great Satan, but also keep in mind that there is no greater destiny for many people than to deal the great Satan a major kick in the teeth. There is one other thing about us that they hate. Many of our adversaries do not like our strategic alliances, especially with Israel. There are many, many people who wish both of us would disappear in a nuclear flash or in a cloud of biological poison, and nothing would give them more pleasure than to be the ones to pull the trigger. Even if they happen to be sitting on top of the bomb. Remember the movie Dr. Strangelove and the part with Slim Pickens riding the nuke as it falls from the plane? This is real-life fantasy for some of our enemies. Our teenage boys fantasize about Cindy Crawford. Young terrorists fantasize about turning an American city and themselves into charcoal. You see my point? Lots of people out there don't like us. But until fairly recently, that didn't make much of a difference. Simply because these malcontents didn't have the ability to cause any major damage. Even if a fanatical America hater happened to be at the controls of a rogue state like Iraq, Iran, or Libya, all he could do is bomb a disco or a jetliner, take hostages away from an embassy, or kidnap tourists. Well, they were always tragedies, not to mention major media events that didn't threaten our nation or our way of life. Most of the time, the best the fanatics could do was round up their subjects, harass them for a couple of hours about how bad America is, then send them back to their dinners of boiled rats and cabbages. What they did strike out in their limited way, they could often count on us returning the favor, as when President Reagan sent bombers against Muammar Gaddafi. Even Bill Clinton has bombed a few suspected terrorist sites, though the timing was always suspect. Mini-war. That was then. Now we can face a threat we've never before encountered. Mini-war. That was then. Now we face a threat never before encountered. One that can strike without warning and devastate our civilian population. In our age of miniaturization, weapons have shrunk, and the threat against us is suddenly very large. When a nuclear device can fit in a suitcase and a canister of anthrax can devastate New York, Boston, Los Angeles, or any other American city, the equation has changed radically. While I write this book, a guy carried a vial of super deadly anthrax poison into a congressional hearing room just to make the same point that my Uncle John Trump had made many years earlier. Uncle John, an MIT professor, didn't think a foreign power was going to send a bomber over the city and drop a conventional weapon. He knew decades ago that miniaturized weapons were coming. He talked about a lone fanatic detonating a weapon at Penn Station that would level the whole town. A biological attack would not take out buildings, but might kill thousands. The city would come to a halt as medical technicians tried to find space for the sick while realizing that most would die anyway. There would have to be new systems devised for the distribution of food, the restoration of businesses, the disposals of the body of the dead. We're in a new ball game, though. You never know it from the political and happy media chatter. You might not win a standing ovation by pointing out that there are male violent people lurking in the shadows with biobombs. That would be the responsible thing to do, and it would be nice to think that our politicians would be as serious about preparing us for a possible disaster as they are about celebrating the stock market's rise. Their chief job, all too often, is to get reelected. They don't want to be the bearers of bad news. For that matter, we rarely hear many ratings-hungry news analysts talking about a subject that is, without a doubt, probably the most frightening of all national scenarios. Yet it's time to get down to the hard business of preparing for what I believe is a real possibility that somewhere, sometime, a weapon of mass destruction will be carried into a major American city and detonated. To his credit, Ted Koppel, in a Nightline series devoted to terrorism, said most experts within both the civilian and military branches of the federal government are now convinced that it is no longer a question of whether there will be a biological attack against an American city. It is now merely a question of when. My hope is that if enough of us start talking about the danger, our elected leaders will address it. The longer they avoid this issue, the more vulnerable they make us. We need to enlighten them now. I've come to two bedrock conclusions about this threat. First, we need to prepare ourselves not only for the possibility of attack, but also for blackmail. There may be times ahead when Americans are given the choice of either holding on to our way of life, our American dream, or giving in to a nuclear or biological threat. There may come a time when we are given the choice between keeping our alliances or suffering an attack. For example, Arab extremists may offer this bargain: cut your ties with Israel, or we will strike a major American city. Such a situation will test us to the depths of our souls. Second, though it's shocking and difficult to accept,
we need to recognize that even if we mobilize, we may not be able to stop every attack. As always, the first line of defense is to try to understand the nature of the threat, then consider how the current leadership is reacting, and finally, decide what kind of improvements we need to make. I've got to say from the outset that I have very little confidence in the way our current leadership is playing our hand. I've seen people like our leaders take similar long odds at casinos. They always leave the tables broke. We know that there are many nations that would like to go down in history for having sent Manhattan, Washington, Los Angeles, or Miami to its knees. We've seen plenty of suicide bombers blowing up buses in Israel, barracks, and embassies around the Middle East, Europe, and Africa, and even buildings here in the U.S. We've seen cultists release poison gas in the Tokyo subway. Whatever their motives, fanaticism, revenge, suffice to say that plenty of people would stand in line for a crack at a suicide mission within America. In fact, the number of potential attackers grows every day. Our various military adventures, some of which are justified, some not, create new legions of people who would like to avenge the deaths of family members or fellow citizens. It is one cost of peacekeeping we should keep in mind.
I am not a hardcore isolationist. While I agree that we stick our noses into too many problems not of our own making and that we can't do much about, I strongly disagree with the idea that we can pull up the drawbridge to hide from rogue nations or individual crazy people. We may overlook the danger created by rogue states because so many of them are small and poor. The combined economy of North Korea, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and Cuba is around 174 billion, as compared with our 7.6 trillion. The military expenditure for these countries combined is about 5% of what we are putting out for defense. But people who make this argument are thinking in the past. They're expecting military threats like battleships, standing armies, strategic bombers, and tank columns. They see war as something they can track with a satellite or through binoculars, as if some hostile navy is going to sail into New York Harbor and open fire. The poverty and fanaticism of rogue states naturally propels them towards exactly the kind of warfare we're not prepared for. Here's another thing to keep in mind. Why would a country use a missile against us when it could more easily, cheaply, and safely infiltrate a biobomb squad? In a conventional attack, we would have a pretty good idea where a missile is launched from and could retaliate appropriately. Not so with a human delivery system. Our adversaries may be fanatical, but they're not out to destroy their own countries. Not appreciating the new, real military dangers is like not knowing about the internet. We should think of the threat not in terms of shells, bullets, and missiles, but as something that is almost invisible and that can penetrate any conventional defenses and borders without detection. Then do its dirty work. We should think of the threat as a virus. There is no doubt that rogue states like Libya and Iraq have more than enough resources to develop miniaturized weapons of mass destruction, especially in the post-Cold War environment, where former Soviet weapons experts are always looking for jobs and don't care who signs the paycheck. But it doesn't take a nation to develop weapons of mass destruction. As the defense expert James H. Anderson reminds us in a Heritage Foundation report, the Japanese cult responsible for the 1995 terrorist attack with sarin gas on the Tokyo subway was a very small group, Shinriko. The key element was dedication. The cult not only brought a 48,000-acre spread in Australia to test their weapons on livestock, but also sent members to Africa to get samples of Ebola virus. The cultists also built 2 research centers. These same people, by the way, were planning a hit on the U.S. Now, if a small group of cultists can strike one of the more sophisticated cities in the world, why would anyone believe that a government with more resources, Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and such, couldn't do immensely more damage to us? In fact, why believe that a cult similar to Shinriko couldn't do the same thing to the New York system? It's not that we have any shortage of cults inside our country whose behavior cannot be accounted for by any rational means. You can be assured that right now there are fanatics whether they sit in the councils of doomsday cults or in the cabinets of rogue states who are plotting and waiting for their moment to strike. The question is, what can we do to best protect our cities? A lot more than you might think. The 21st century spy. All business success is based on acquiring information, so maybe I have a natural interest in intelligence. One of our most important tools is as old as humanity itself. That tool is the spy. We need to train and employ a lot more of them. We need to be shelling out a lot more money for what the experts call human intelligence, which is to say, informants who live and operate within the rogue nations, who join cults of zealots, and who know the shady underworld in which our enemies often operate. Do I believe spies can save us from a biobomb? Not every time, but one of the ironies of war against ultra-high-tech miniaturized weapons is that our best defense isn't high-tech satellite surveillance, but good old-fashioned intelligence gathering done by agents who are trained in the serious work of infiltrating terrorist groups. In cop terms, we're talking about a gun show operation. Gumshoe operation. Beating the bricks for information. Nothing fancy about it. But ultimately, we can minimize danger by the strategic deployment of shoe leather. Because the potential losses are so huge, we should be willing to spend whatever is necessary and reasonable on the preventive side. After all, how do you put a price on the life of a great American city? Unfortunately, we have a lot of psychic capital invested in high-tech surveillance, and as a result, have let our intelligence capabilities shrink. Reversing this trend won't be easy. In Washington, in the budget battles, the flashy hardware usually has the upper hand. James A. H. Anderson puts it this way: our penchant for technological means has crowded out the development of human intelligence capabilities. The revitalization of human intelligence capabilities is long overdue. Satellite surveillance is wonderful, but it is no substitute for eyes and ears on the ground to ascertain enemy intentions. This same point is made by former Reagan State Department official Abraham Sofar in 5 Ways to Beat the Thugs. It is widely agreed that the U.S. lacks sufficient human intelligence capability. Penetrating groups of radicals and religious fanatics is difficult and distasteful, but it is now familiar work, and great successes have been achieved, such as preventing an attack on the visa line at the U.S. Embassy in Paris in 1968, and other attacks planned at around that time. Congress should keep the pressure on the CIA and FBI to strengthen these capabilities. Pressure couldn't come a second too soon. So far, it tells us a story of incompetence that hits very close to home. The inadequate use of intelligence is persuasive. When in 1990, El Sayed Nosar was arrested for the murder of Rabbi Meir Kanhan, the FBI failed to translate papers found in his home because its New York City office had no Arabic translator available. Those papers contained useful leads that might have enabled the FBI to prevent the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. That's bad enough. After all, there is a lot of Arabs who just don't like us. It would follow that our anti-terrorist squad would keep a few people around who could read Arabic. They didn't plan, but so far says the story gets worse. When the mastermind of the Trade Center bombing, Ramzi Youssef, entered the U.S. with a false passport, he was caught by the Immigration and Naturalization Service, but released because the government lacked space in a local facility to hold him pending deportation. He then disregarded orders that he appear for a hearing and went about successfully arranging the Trade Center bombing. We talk a lot about this in society, about the warning signs, whether at public high schools, which have their own internal terrorist problems, or in the nation at large. If we would acknowledge the threat we face, we won't allow suspicious people to enter our country on a false passport. We would find room to jail guilty people. We would do that because we knew we are vulnerable to attack. If we were taking this threat seriously, this particular bombing probably wouldn't have happened. Identifying a problem is just part of the political game. The real fight is coming up, with the money to pay for the fix. Where do we find the funding necessary to pay for the human intelligence that may prevent a madman from destroying a U.S. city?
There's no doubt in my mind that once the American people are awakened to this threat, they'll be willing to pay for any reasonable means of defense. In fact, I bet if I started a national defense lottery with money earmarked for preventing terrorism against U.S. cities, we would take in enough money to hire and train every spy on Earth and still have money to spare. Imagine this for a second. The Trump National Security Lottery would sell tickets just like in a Powerball lottery, but dedicate every cent to funding an anti-terrorism campaign. Talk about a good reason to buy a lottery ticket. To give us the best chance possible to avoid an attack, we have to raise people's awareness. That's another reason why a lottery wouldn't be a bad idea. Redirecting missile defense money to human intelligence would also serve a public relations role by reminding the public that this threat is real and we're going to have to spend some real money on it. Defense money. The linkage would be important. Bioterrorism. According to the Department of Defense, as reported in a policy analysis from the Cato Institute, 5 pounds of anthrax could wipe out half of Washington, D.C. You can't defend against that with satellites and laser beams. This is the irony of our times. High-tech threats require low-tech defenses. But there are some means of attack that seem nearly impossible to defend against. Recently in New York, there's been a breakout of an extremely rare type of encephalitis never seen before in this country. It is transmitted through diseased cows that are bitten by mosquitoes, then that bite humans. The fever grows. The fever appears to come from the West Nile, but no one has a theory on how it arrived. A massive spraying campaign was undertaken in the city to kill the mosquitoes. This sounds like one of those odd, nasty tricks nature plays. The director of the city's Emergency Management Office and the Federal Centers for Disease Control and Prevention called it a purely natural phenomenon, but the CIA reported that an Iraqi defector claimed that Saddam Hussein was developing a strain of virus for use in a bioterrorism campaign. The defector, Michael Randaman, had an excerpt from his book published in the London Daily Mail in April 1999. We need to be aware of the dangers like this and be prepared for them. I want to pass along a few more ideas about responding to bioterrorism that I've come across in my reading. We need to stockpile antibiotics in major population areas and train emergency workers to respond quickly to biological attack. Perhaps some of those people in the criminal justice system who are doing community service could learn emergency response. We need to develop and deploy sensors in major cities that will give us early warning that biological devices have been detonated. Remember, these microbes can take a while to spread, so any warning that we have will help to save lives, perhaps tens of thousands of them. We need to keep a very close eye on former Soviet biotechnicians, offering them jobs where we can and steering them clear of terrorist regimes. Call your congressman. When private citizens start talking about the joint statement on biological weapons, politicians will know this is an issue they'd better start taking seriously. Prepare for the possibility of an attack. To avoid total panic in case an attack does occur, our adversaries understand that if they are able to blindside us, they will be much more likely to succeed in blackmailing us. This is all grim material, and if we're playing it safe, trying to make people feel good, if I were hoping to offend nobody or concerned about fundraising, I'd keep these thoughts to myself. I'm telling you the hard truth, because, unlike almost all other public figures, I can afford to be truthful. There will be people who will say that Trump is hardly in a position to lecture the nation on the perils of modern warfare. Where does a real estate guy get off thinking he is a prophet on national defense? But who are the experts, and what have they done for us lately? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to understand we are living in a very dangerous time. It does take courage to say so, and it doesn't take a brain surgeon to find possible solutions. All it takes is a willingness to become informed and a desire to be part of the solution. Unlike other candidates, I'm in a position to bring these issues to the foreground, and it could not be wrong to do so. Chapter 6 will be called
an economic boom for America.